Ghost Story Village Spirits. Author Anonymous. I was born and raised in a rural area in central Vietnam. Back then, most of the villagers were farmers. Early in the morning, they would go to the fields, irrigating and cutting grass by hand since there were no machines like today. They spent the entire day in the fields, coming home for a quick meal at noon before heading back to continue their work. We children had our own tasks. Some of us herded buffaloes, while the younger ones gathered in groups to catch crabs and fish in the streams to help provide for our families. I always remember the song of Teo, a friend of mine. This afternoon, I'll go fishing so my mom can make sour fish soup. So we spent the whole day in the river. Even the least successful among us would catch at least 10 fish by the end of the day, enough to make a pot of fish soup. Life in the countryside was like that. Everyone had their own work during the day, but at night, every 2 or 3 days, most of the villagers would gather at someone's house after dinner to chat, gossip, and discuss current events. Back then, we were still very poor. No one had a TV for entertainment, so gathering together was a way to find joy and strengthen community bonds. Thinking back now, I realize how simple yet meaningful those rural lives were. There's something precious about those habits that we can't find in today's world of information and modern entertainment. The usual gathering spot in the village was the front yard of my house. I remember my family being very hospitable. Whenever someone from the village visited, they were warmly welcomed. Sometimes even in the middle of work, everything would be set aside immediately after the warm greetings, and a fresh pot of hot green tea would be brewed. I was often tasked with laying out mats on the ground, following the villagers' request. Lay the mats on the ground to sit. It's cooler, and we're all country folks. No need for formalities. These words from our neighbor, Mr. Thiem, to my father have stayed with me until now. It's also why I have some interesting ghost stories to share with you today. One night, after dinner, as usual, the villagers gathered at my house. Taking a sip of fresh tea, Mrs. Nat Chow remarked, "Tonight is the 14th, almost the full moon. The moon is so bright, but since dusk, there hasn't been a single breeze. It's so hot, isn't it, Mrs. Ba?" Sitting in the corner of the house, Mrs. Ba Len, locals often called each other by the family order, was fanning herself with a bamboo fan. "Yes, it's been so hot since the afternoon. How is Mr. Hai doing now, Mrs. Hai?" Before Mrs. Chow could answer, Mr. Thiem interjected, "What's wrong with Mr. Hai, Mrs. Hai?" "Just the evening before yesterday, I saw him carrying a hoe to till the land. He said he was planning to fix up the fallow land at your place to plant corn and earn some extra income. Just yesterday, he was still out tilling the soil until dusk," Mrs. Chow said slowly, sighing. "After dinner, he told me he had something important to discuss with Mr. Bai. He didn't return until around 10 p.m., and when he did, he reeked of alcohol, his face completely drained of color. Worried, I asked him what had happened, but he didn't say a word. His body was trembling, covered in sweat. After drinking a glass of lemon water I made, he immediately jumped into bed and covered himself from head to toe, blew it out, and went to sleep." Mrs. Chow paused, took a sip of tea as if to gather her thoughts, making Mr. Thiem impatient. "And then what happened next, Mrs. Hai?" Placing the teacup back on the mat, Mrs. Chow's expression changed, and so did her tone. She whispered, "My husband encountered a ghost last night. When he woke the next morning after breakfast, I pressed him about what had happened to make him so frightened. Only then did he reveal what had happened. Hearing about a ghost immediately shifted the atmosphere. Some villagers who had been silent and pensive now became lively and curious. What happened, Mrs. Hai? Did Mr. Hai see a ghost? Where did he see it? It happened right in the village. My husband, after drinking at Mr. Bay's house, he was a bit tipsy. Mr. Bay had his son get a bicycle to take him home, but he refused. So he walked back to our village, and by then it was nearly 10 p.m. As he passed by the banana grove near Mr. Tu Chai's house, he saw a chicken crossing back and forth in front of him. It struck him as odd. He wondered whose chicken it was and why it wasn't roosting at that hour, but instead wandering around as if searching for something. He found it strange and continued walking. And then what happened, Mrs. Hai? What about the chicken? It's indeed odd for a chicken to be wandering around at that time instead of roosting, the villagers chimed in, adding to the story's liveliness. Back and still saw the chicken pacing back and forth as if taunting him. Annoyed, he picked up a large rock and threw it at the chicken, intending to see if it would get scared and run away. To his horror, after throwing the rock, the chicken disappeared. Instead, a person slowly rose from the ground, then stood up, as tall as a pole. He couldn't see its face, just a shadowy figure moving towards him. Terrified, he ran straight home without saying a word until morning. At this point, Mrs. Ba Len, who had been silently listening, spoke up. "Yes, it's right at Mr. Tuchai's banana grove. I've heard many people say there's a ghost there, but I didn't believe it. Even my son once saw something there, but it wasn't a chicken. It was a very horrifying sight. I wonder if anyone here has heard about it?" Hearing Mrs. Ba Len, the villagers became even more animated. "What did your son see, Mrs. Ba? Was it as terrifying as the story my nephew told me a few years ago when he was out fishing?" My Aunt Oot interjected. "Where did your nephew see a ghost, and what happened?" Mrs. Ba Len continued, "Tell your story first, and then I'll tell everyone about my son's experience. Here's what happened. My husband's nephew, Mien, goes fishing every day and sells his catch at the market. That day, after fishing, it started pouring rain. Usually he comes back around 4 or 5 in the afternoon when it's still light out, just after sunset. But that day it rained all afternoon, making the sky gloomy. So by 5 p.m. it was as dark as 7 or 8 p.m. On his way home, as he passed by the plum tree at Mrs. Sauha's house in the lower village, he saw something strange in the tree. At first he focused on getting home quickly to find something to eat, as he hadn't had any food since lunch. But something seemed to lure him back. After walking quite a distance, Mien thought to himself, what was that strange thing in the plum tree? So he decided to find out. He took a few steps back, carefully parting the branches to see better. There was nothing there except the thick foliage swaying in the wind and rain like skeletal arms. Disappointed, Mien turned to leave, but as he did, he saw something white swinging from the plum tree. The sight was a bit clearer than before. Being curious, Mien couldn't let it go. He decided to go back to the tree and investigate. At this point, Aunt Oot paused, grabbing a cup of tea and drinking it in one go, as if she were tired and thirsty after a long day of work. The villagers began to murmur, the previously silent atmosphere now replaced with a buzz of excitement. Wow, this is so suspenseful. What did Mien in the tree? This kid is something else. It was already getting dark, and instead of hurrying home for dinner, he was wandering around, commented Mrs. Haicho. Well, you know how youngsters are. They're not afraid of anything. We go to bed by 8 or 9 p.m., but they stay out, drinking and singing with friends until 11 or 12 at night. Sometimes they come to Mrs. Bay's shop next to my house, and we end up staying up with them until midnight, Mr. Tiem responded. At this point, Aunt Oot continued her story. And so, the second time Mien went back, he still didn't see anything. Frustrated, he crouched down in a nearby bamboo grove and sat observing the plum tree. After a while, he fell asleep without realizing it. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through, making the bamboo creak and whistle, startling Mien awake. He focused his eyes on the plum tree and saw a figure sitting there. The person was silently on a branch. At first, Mien thought it was someone stealing plums, so he quietly bent down, picked up a rock, and planned to throw it to scare the person away. But just as he was about to throw it, the figure began to move. Slowly, the white shadow rose from the branch as if lifted by an unseen force, stretching an arm out so far that it could reach the mangoes on a distant tree. Seeing this, Mien felt all his strength drain away, the rock slipping from his hand with a thud. His mouth hung open in shock, and the fishing gear fell to the ground. Terrified, he ran home as fast as he could, his face pale as a banana leaf. Despite the light rain, he was drenched in sweat. He left at around 8 a.m. and returned by 3 p.m., refusing to stay out until 5 p.m. He even stayed home for 3 days before daring to go fishing again. Looking back, it was both frightening and amusing. Truly, every time it drizzles and I pass by Mrs. Sauha's plum tree in the lower village at dusk, I feel a chill, even though I've never seen anything myself. Maybe I'm too faint-hearted for ghosts to show themselves to me. Anut's comment made the neighbors laugh. Indeed, that night was a special one for my family and me. I was very young back then, but whether it was because I loved ghost stories or because of my good memory, those moments are still vivid in my mind today. It's something. Villagers gathered again. That day, it was drizzling. After dinner, my father went to the kitchen to light a fire, both to warm the house and to boil some sweet potatoes for everyone to enjoy in the chill of the early season rain. He assumed that with the rain, everyone in the village had already gone to bed. With this rain, I bet everyone is asleep already, he said. It's so quiet outside, no one is out on the streets. My mother's question made my father laugh. He knew well the customs of the villagers. A light drizzle, even if it was pouring rain, once a meeting was arranged, the villagers rarely broke their appointments. Besides, it seemed like everyone in this village was used to the routine of meeting each other every night, no matter what. So tonight, the villagers gathered at my house again, albeit a bit later than usual, but still quite a crowd. Uncle Thiam started the conversation with a trembling voice, perhaps because of the cold weather. It's been drizzling all day, hasn't it, everyone? It reminds me of an incident from a few years ago when I used to cut firewood on the mountain to cook pig feed. I don't know if it was fate or what, but I encountered a ghost. Since then, I've rarely gone to cut wood at dawn, only when I have some free time outside of my gardening chores. What happened, Thiam? You saw a ghost? How come you've never mentioned this before? My father asked as he poured tea into Uncle Thiam's cup and others. The story goes like this. At that time, my family was raising a few piglets to sell for some extra income to cover daily expenses. You know well, my family has many children. Depending solely on our vegetable garden wasn't enough to make ends meet. So my wife bought 2 piglets from the market, initially just to try it out, but they grew so quickly that I decided to buy a few more. We had plenty of vegetables from the garden to feed them, and if we collected leftover rice from our neighbors took pig feed, it was sufficient. The problem was we lacked fire, the garden only had vegetables. So from that day on, I started waking up early to gather firewood. I remember that day, it was still dark. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning all night. Frustrated, I got up, went to the kitchen to make some tea, and after drinking it, I headed out to gather firewood. The streets were deserted, not a soul in sight, so I walked alone. When I reached the place, I started picking up dry sticks and used a machete to cut thicker branches. While chopping, I noticed someone else seemed to be gathering firewood on the other side of the Sim hill, hidden behind dense bushes. Curious, I stopped and moved closer to the Sim bushes to get a better look. Through the thick foliage of the old Sim bushes, I saw a young woman in a gray ao baba, bent over to pick up dry sticks. She wore a conical hat that appeared tattered. I tried to get a closer look at her face to see whose daughter she might be, out gathering firewood so early, but no matter how much I strained my eyes, I couldn't see her face. So I left the Sim bushes, went back to my spot, and continued my work. After gathering a decent amount of firewood, I decided to throw the bundle over my shoulder and head back. Before descending the mountain, I turned to see if the girl was still collecting firewood. She was still there, bent over, diligently picking up each dry branch and tying them into a bundle. Seeing her like that stirred a sense of compassion in me for the children of poor families. Poor girl. Having to venture into the mountains at such an early hour to gather firewood and vegetables to help her family. It was truly heartbreaking. Thinking this to myself, I continued walking. After a while, as I neared the slope leading down to the village road, I saw a girl in the distance coming towards me. It seemed she was also out collecting firewood, since this was the mountain path and anyone going up at this hour would likely be doing so for that reason. The girl walked past me quite gently. At first, I didn't pay much attention to her, so I only saw her figure and didn't catch a glimpse of her face. Another girl out collecting firewood at dawn, I threw away. However, after a few steps, I suddenly remembered that the girl who had just passed by was dressed very similarly to the one I had seen earlier collecting firewood. But she was still up on the mountain, busy gathering branches. This made me curious, so I decided to run back to the spot to see what was really going on. When I got to the spot, I didn't see anyone at all. Both the girl who was collecting firewood with me earlier and the girl who had just passed by were gone. How strange, I thought. Where could they have gone? They were just here a moment ago. The path from the village to the mountain is only one, and this mountain is mostly barren with few trees, mostly small ones, no large old trees at all. If the girl collecting firewood with me had gone back, she would have had to take my path down to the village, but I didn't see her go down at all. And the girl who had just passed me was only a few steps ahead, yet now she's nowhere to be seen either. Thinking about this, I suddenly remembered my cousin's words. If you go to collect firewood, don't go too early or you might encounter a ghost. I've seen one before, so be cautious. At that time, I had just laughed it off, thinking he must have been sleepy and imagined things. But could it be true? Thinking about this, I felt a chill run down my spine. Finding myself alone in the twilight, having just seen two mysterious figures amidst the drizzle, I felt goosebumps all over my body. I threw down the bundle of firewood I was carrying and ran straight home as if chased by ghosts, when in reality, I had encountered them. Uncle Theum paused for a moment, took a sip of tea, and continued. Since then, I've collected firewood less often, and when I do, I go around 7 or 8 in the morning and always take a few people with me. I never go alone anymore. I heard this story from my grandmother when I was very small. Nearly 30 years have passed, but the details of the story remain vivid in my mind. It must have left a strong impression on my young, impressionable mind back then. My grandmother's hometown was in Ninh Binh, in the north. She was acquainted with a woman named Nio Trin, who was also in her 60s at the time. In the countryside back then, people were very close-knit and supportive of each other, especially since Nio Trin was a role model for all women. Her entire life, from childhood until she passed away, was dedicated to helping others without hesitation. Almost all the women in her village, and even those in neighboring villages, sought her help during childbirth. She was a renowned midwife in the region, known for her skillful hands. Remarkably, she never took any payment for her services. The villagers were poor and valued kindness and mutual support over material wealth. As a result, everyone respected and loved her, from children to elders, who all affectionately called her grandmother. People often brought her small gifts like sweet potatoes or betel leaves as tokens of appreciation. Her parents died early, leaving her to raise her younger siblings. She didn't marry until she was 30, becoming a concubine to Nio Trin. The family was sparse, with only one son per generation from her husband's family line. Her husband had 3 wives before her, but none bore him children. Yet, a year after she joined him, she bore a son, much to his delight. He cherished their son dearly, and thus she too was cherished. Despite her husband having multiple wives, there was harmony among them, with mutual respect and care, whom they adored and indulged. As time passed, the 3 previous wives in Nio Trin passed away, leaving her to raise their son alone. She took on all the family and community responsibilities, managing everything with dedication. When Truk got married, she was overjoyed, hoping her good and kind daughter-in-law would soon give her a bunch of grandchildren to bring more joy to the household. But it seemed like a lingering curse, as it took 16 years after his marriage for Truk to have a son. When her grandson was born, she felt a wish of a few more grandchildren. Her grandson Vin was only 3 years old at the time. She loved him dearly, bathing and caring for him every day. As she grew older and weaker, the person she worried about the most was her eldest grandson. Every time she looked at him, tears would stream down her face because she knew that the day they would have to part was approaching. She often saved the little treats and sweets brought by relatives for him. Everyone in life experiences separation and death, whether they are good or bad. Eventually, she too reached the point where she could no longer hold on. She hadn't been able to eat for nearly 10 days and could only moisten her lips with a few drops. An owl perched on the eaves of the house and hooted incessantly. The villagers believed that if an owl perched on a roof and hooted, it was a sign that someone in the house would die. On the day she died, it poured rain, with continuous thunder and lightning. Even at noon, there was no sunlight. She took her last breath at noon, amid the mourning of everyone. Because she died of old age and had not eaten or drunk anything for almost 10 days, she had become even more emaciated. The neighbors gathered to help with her funeral arrangements. Some chopped banana trees to place in front of the coffin, others boiled eggs and prepared coconut offerings. She died on an inauspicious day, and the following days were also bad, but they couldn't keep the coffin for too long. So, everyone decided that since she had been kind-hearted all her life, it wouldn't matter. They planned to bury her on the third day. The nights passed uneventfully until the last night, when many strange things occurred. The owl kept hooting, even though there was already a death in the house. The cats howled all night, and the dogs barked incessantly throughout the village. No one said anything, but everyone felt a vague sense of unease, as if something was about to happen. More than a dozen people stayed up through the night to watch over her coffin. The young men gathered in a corner to tell ghost stories, while the older folks talked about the village and the crops. A few dozen it was Neotrin's coffin. Around 3 a.m, there was a faint noise. Initially, no one paid attention, but the noise grew louder and clearer. People started speculating about the source of the noise, with some saying it was rats and others saying it was dogs. No one wanted to believe the noise was coming from the coffin because they were all trying to avoid that thought. Suddenly, little Vin, who had been sleeping, sat up and called for his grandmother. He said he heard his grandmother calling him and kept staring at the coffin where she lay. No one dared to say a word. The dogs stopped barking, and the cats ceased their howling. In the stifling atmosphere, as silent as before a storm, the voice of Neotrin echoed weakly from inside the coffin. "Let me out! Let me out! I'm still alive here!" With panic gripping them, everyone scrambled out of Truk's house, driven by fear. Curiosity often brings much trouble and sometimes leads to disasters. After leaving Truk's house for a while, everyone stopped and gathered together to listen for any unusual sounds. After a long while with nothing happening, a few young men dared each other to return to the house and see if anything had changed. Truk and his wife had each thought the other had taken the child, only to realize they had both run off without him. They decided to return to retrieve Vin. What was strange was that Vin, who never stayed alone, had not cried since they left. Truk led the group of young men back. Each tried to appear unafraid, reasoning that there couldn't be ghosts, but their hearts pounded nonetheless. As they approached the house, they heard Vin talking. Each word from the child sent shivers down their spines. So they all ran out again, the mother trembling in fear. Truk, feeling the bond between father and son stronger than any fear, crept back to the house alone. Inside, apart from Vin's voice, there was no other sound. Summoning all his courage, everyone was eager to hear what Vin had to say. They were all puzzled. Who was Vin talking to? The child, in his childish manner, explained that his grandmother was not dead, just tired and asleep. She was lying in the coffin, waiting for his father Truk to come and let her out. Truk, upon hearing this, felt all his fear dissipate. He only felt pity for his mother, lying in the coffin for 2 days and 1 night. He rushed inside to take her out. As he approached, he heard Neotrin whisper, "Truk, let me out. I'm tired of lying here. Who tied me up so tightly?" Hearing this, Truk became even more convinced that his mother was still alive, so he hurried to open the coffin. By this time, everyone but still nervous. Several young men rushed forward to lift her out of the coffin. Strangely, while she had felt light as a child before, she now seemed much heavier. Bak, who had personally prepared her body the day before, now helped remove the layers of cloth. He blamed himself for being careless enough to bury her alive. As each layer was removed, no one noticed that Neotrin now spoke more forcefully and sharply than her calm demeanor before. As the final layer was removed, Neotrin looked around at everyone and said with a sneer, "So, were you all eagerly awaiting my death? Is that why as soon as I dozed off, you hurried to prepare my funeral?" Everyone stayed to talk with her, but she kept complaining and asking for food. Truk was overjoyed to see his mother hungry. Ever since Neo had revived, Truk's wife had rushed to the kitchen to prepare some porridge, intending to give her some broth to regain her strength. The porridge wasn't fully cooked, but Neo's hunger was so intense that Truk's wife decided to serve a bowl anyway. Seeing the bowl, Neo's eyes lit up, and she grabbed it from her daughter-in-law's hands, gulping it down in one go. The porridge was still hot, but she didn't seem to notice. It was probably due to her 10 days of fasting and 2 days without water in the coffin that made her. She urged her daughter-in-law to fetch more. Truk's wife hurriedly brought the entire pot of porridge. While waiting, Neo noticed a bunch of bananas at the head of the coffin and asked someone nearby to bring them to her. The bananas were still green, yet she ate them one by one as if they were a delicacy. Her way of eating was more like swallowing, since she had no teeth to chew. After spending a long time with her, everyone suggested she rest. Neo didn't want to, as she was enjoying the conversation. Even after the last person left, she kept talking. It wasn't until 6 in the morning that she yawned and said she was sleepy. Truk helped his mother to bed and asked his wife to help tidy up the funeral items. Was left in the corner of the house. It was customary in the countryside to keep coffins at home for elderly family members. Neo slept soundly all day. Truk tried to wake her several times for meals, but she didn't stir. Occasionally he checked to see if she was still alive. She lay there, as weak and intermittently breathing as before, unlike her lively state the night before. Vin cried for his grandmother to hold him, but she didn't open her eyes from the moment she slept until dusk. Around 6 in the evening, she stirred and woke up, complaining of hunger and scolding Vin for disturbing her sleep. Truk's wife had prepared another pot of porridge, which she served to Neo. Just like the previous night, Neo didn't wait for it to cool. Bowl after bowl, she ate until Truk's wife had to bring the entire pot. She had planned for the porridge to last until the evening, but Neo finished it all in one sitting. Vin stood by, looking longingly at the food, remembering how his grandmother always shared with him before. After eating, Neo put on a conical hat and left the house. Her movements were swift, unlike those of an elderly person or someone who had just survived a near-death experience. Truk felt a bit uneasy seeing his mother wearing a hat when there was no strong sunlight, but he didn't ask any questions, assuming it was natural for her to behave differently after such an ordeal. When Neotrin reached the end of the lane, she encountered her neighbors, who warmly inquired about her and expressed relief that she had survived such a perilous ordeal. However, instead of reciprocating their kindness, she responded with an air of disdain. She didn't say a word, just cast sidelong glances that left those trying to engage her feeling both puzzled and slightly fearful. As she passed by Mr. Bach's house, she saw Mrs. Bach and her grandson loitering outside. Niu immediately berated them about Mr. Bach wrapping her too tightly in the shroud. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bach's young grandson, holding a sweet potato, was left bewildered when Neo snatched it from his hand and ate it greedily, causing him to cry loudly. His grandmother couldn't understand why he was acting up. As evening fell, the chickens at Mrs. Bach's house began to roost. When Neo saw the hens with their chicks, her eyes gleamed with a peculiar brightness. After chatting for a while, Neo left abruptly. Passing by the chicken coop, she cast a calculating glance towards it. Back home, Truk anxiously waited for his mother to return for dinner. Growing impatient, he went out to look for her. It was already dark when he spotted a figure moving quickly towards their house. It was Neotrin. She was no longer wearing her hat and looked at him with wild eyes, yet her expression was much more cheerful than when she had left. At the dinner table, Nyo ate several bowls of rice, choosing the best dishes to satisfy her hunger. Vin kept glancing between his grandmother and the food, clearly puzzled. When Truk and his wife finished washing up and sat down to eat, they found only a few scraps of burnt rice at the bottom of the pot and nearly no food left except for a few pieces of vegetable. Meanwhile, Neo Trin sat at the head of the bed, drinking green tea. She had her legs up on the bed and swirled the tea in her mouth noisily. Seeing his mother behave so oddly, Truk was a bit didn't dare say anything. In the countryside, people went to bed early, usually right after dinner. The same was true for Neotrin's family. After settling down, Truk and his wife lay in bed for a long time, still seeing Neo sitting on the bed, drinking tea and talking to herself. Her conversations were nonsensical and incessant. Truk and his wife whispered to each other, wondering what was wrong with her, but neither had any answers. Exhausted, they eventually fell asleep without realizing it. The next morning, Truk got up early to go to the fields and found his mother lying weakly in bed, her breathing faint. He assumed she was just tired from staying up too late the previous night. After reminding his wife to take care of her, he grabbed his farming tools and headed out. Like the previous day, Nyo lay on the bed, unable to even sip water. In their village, theft had never been a problem, so people rarely worried about losing their belongings. But that day, Mrs. Botch discovered one of her hens was missing. She searched everywhere but couldn't find it. The motherless chicks wandered aimlessly, looking lost and pitiful. Fortunately, Mrs. Bach had other hens with chicks, so she decided to let them join the other brood. By evening, when Truk returned home to check on his mother, she was nowhere to be found. His wife explained that she had just eaten a pot of boiled cassava, put on her hat, and left. She also mentioned that earlier, Nyo had taken Vin to the porch and beaten him with a broom for persistently asking to be held. Although she felt sorry for her son, she didn't dare say anything, fearing it would upset her mother-in-law. From that point on, during the day, Nyo would lie lethargically like a fish out of water. But as soon as the sun was about to set, she would put on her hat and leave the house. Neighbors noticed her increasingly erratic behavior. Children, in particular, would hide behind adults whenever they saw her glaring eyes. Initially, people attributed her changed demeanor to the near-death experience, but gradually everyone began to fear her, not just the children, but also the adults. Whenever they saw her from a distance, they would try to avoid her, but often failed because she moved so quickly, suddenly appearing right beside them. Whenever she encountered someone, she would mutter incomprehensibly, with the occasional discernible words being about swallowing and strangling. Her eyes grew brighter, resembling a cat's eyes shining in the dark. The village was plagued by frequent chicken thefts, which diligently secured their chicken coops at night. But the thefts continued, with up to 2 or 3 chickens disappearing on busier nights. Oddly, chickens, which usually made a racket when disturbed, were silent during these thefts, leaving homeowners unaware until they found feathers scattered around the bamboo grove the next morning. The villagers, bewildered and anxious, were determined to catch the cunning fox. Meanwhile, strange occurrences continued at Truk's home. Neotrin looked increasingly rosy and youthful. Remarkably, she started to regrow her teeth and her hair turned black again. She no longer lay in bed all day. Instead, she would wake up vibrant at noon and remain active in sleep. Vin, who used to be her cherished grandchild, was now disliked. Whenever she saw him, she would drag him out and beat him. Eventually, he became as frightened of her as the other village children. Neo's appetite grew voracious, outpacing even 2 young men. Each night, she could consume a pot of rice weighing 2 kilograms. She particularly craved fresh, living things. One day, Truk's wife bought some fish from the village pond and kept them in a water basin, planning to cook them later. However, when she returned after finishing her chores, the fish were gone. Perplexed, she searched the house. Approaching her mother-in-law, who was lying on the bed, she saw fish scales stuck to Neo's lips. She told her husband about it, but Truk dismissed her, saying she was talking nonsense. In truth, he said this just to reassure her, because a few days earlier, he had seen his mother catch and swallow a lizard alive. A month had passed since Nioching came back to life, and many changes had taken place in the small. The most significant change was that people no longer called Nio affectionately as Granny. One afternoon, a stranger visited Thum's roadside tea stall at the edge of the village. The man, who seemed to be in his 60s, was emaciated and dark-skinned, with a haggard face, but his eyes were sharp. He sat drinking tea, his gaze fixed intently on the end of the village. He asked Thum if anything unusual had happened in the village recently. Thum recounted the entire story to him. Just then, Nio Trin, wearing a conical hat, walked briskly past. Before Thum could say anything, the stranger asked, "Is that the old woman who supposedly came back to life?" Thum nodded. The stranger continued, "If you truly want to save her son's family, get someone from their household to come here and meet me as soon as possible, but make sure the old woman doesn't find out." Thum didn't understand what was happening, but sensing the urgency in his voice, she left her tea stall under his watch and rushed to find Truk. Upon arrival, she didn't dare call out, but stood hesitantly at the gate because she could hear Nio cursing inside. She saw Truk and his wife standing nearby. As she was trying to signal Truk's wife, she suddenly heard Nio mention her name. "If that Thum dares to show her face here, I'll twist her neck from front to back." Terrified, Thum fled, running as fast as she could back to her tea stall. She recounted the incident to the stranger. He listened intently and finally remarked, "So, she knows now." But not before giving her a final instruction. "Tell Truk to meet me here early tomorrow morning. It's urgent and life-threatening." Thum didn't dare return to Truk's house, so she asked a neighbor whose field was next to Truk's to pass on the message. Hearing the news, Truk immediately dropped his work and rushed out, wondering what had made his mother so angry at noon and why Thum wanted to meet him now. Thum recounted to him what the stranger had told her earlier and warned him to be extremely careful not to let Nio know. That night was different from every other night. Nio didn't leave the house. She sat squatting on the bed, constantly cursing, and she held on to little Vin tightly, not letting him go anywhere despite the boy crying until he was hoarse. Truk sensed that something was wrong, so early the next morning, when Nio finally lay down to sleep, he rushed out to the edge of the village to meet the strange old man. When he arrived, impatience. After catching his breath, Truk began to recount all the strange occurrences to the old man. The old man then explained that the person in his home was no longer his mother. Because his mother died at an auspicious time, a demon had possessed her body. Yesterday, I passed through this village and noticed that the end of the village was filled with negative energy. While I was sitting here drinking tea, I saw it walking tiptoe past this place. It has now gained a lot of strength. As the 100th day approaches since your mother came back to life, that demon will no longer steal chickens or eat live fish. It will target your boy." Hearing this, Truk turned pale, sweat to save his family and the village. The old man gave him 3 red talismans and gave him detailed instructions. Whatever the old man said, Truk kept nodding and agreeing. By the time he returned home, it was already noon. Nio was no longer sleeping, but had woken up demanding food, still holding on to Vin tightly. Truk tried to suggest taking the boy for a haircut so she would let him go, but she refused to loosen her grip even for a moment. Seeing this, Truk's face showed clear worry. All afternoon, Nio didn't leave the house. After eating, she fell asleep, clutching Vin. The boy had cried so much since the previous day that he was utterly exhausted and weak. Truk's wife tried to appease her by running to the neighbor's house to quickly buy a chicken, which she cleaned and boiled. When she brought it to Nio, the old woman started cursing again. Nio scolded Truk's wife for being stupid, for bringing her a dead chicken when it had been so fresh. Hearing this made Truk's wife's hair stand on end. Eventually, Nio finished eating the chicken. Vin's mother pleaded with her to release the boy so he could eat some porridge, but Nio refused and demanded that she give the porridge to her to feed the boy herself. That day was the 98th day since Neo had come back to life. On the 99th day, Neo's health seemed to improve dramatically. She no longer slept at all, staying awake through both night and day. Following the old man's instructions, Truk told his wife to continue bringing boiled chicken to Neo, even though she demanded fresh chicken. While eating, Neo cursed continuously. Her eyes were bloodshot and her speech had become clear. She said she would eat the flesh and drink the blood of everyone in the village until no one was left. That night, Thum relayed the old man's message to the village elders. They gathered at the village communal house, the most sacred place in the village, to discuss the urgent matter. The elders then sent for the strongest and quickest young men in the village to assign them their tasks. Today is the 100th day. From the first crow of the rooster, Neo showed great joy, laughing and talking loudly as if waiting for something. As noon approached, she became more active and fierce. Meanwhile, Truk and his wife didn't know how to get the boy out since she wouldn't let him go even for a moment. After some thought, Truk's wife had an idea. At that moment, Neo was upstairs yelling for food. Instead of bringing her boiled chicken as she had for the past few days, this time Truk's wife hen. Seeing the chicken, Neo's eyes lit up and she lunged forward to snatch it from Truk's wife's hands. Just then, Truk, who had been hiding, quickly grabbed Vin and ran out of the house. Neo froze for a moment before screaming and chasing after him. Outside, several young men and the strange old man were ready. They used mulberry branches to ward her off, preventing her from jumping out the door. However, she became extraordinarily agile and ferocious, leaping around the three-room house without touching the ground. The old man then entered the house, holding a willow branch and a bottle of holy water. Truk approached from the kitchen door. Seeing the old man, Neo retreated towards the kitchen. When she saw Truk, she screamed. Truk panicked and was about to run when the old man shouted, "Throw the talisman at her or she will kill you." Truk turned back, mustering all his courage, and threw a talisman at Neo. She hesitated, seemingly frightened, but when she saw that he missed, she lunged at him again. Truk threw the second talisman, but missed again. Now, she was only 2 arms lengths away from him, and Truk was sure his death was imminent. He closed his eyes and desperately threw the third talisman. Fortunately, it hit her right in the chest. At that moment, her appearance changed completely. She no longer looked like Neo. Her hair stood on end, her eyes were blood red and bulging, and her mouth gaped open, showing white teeth. She screamed and fell to the ground. People then crowded into the house. On the floor was now a rotting corpse, with no part of the body intact and the face unrecognizable. This was Neo's true form, as she had been dead for 100 days. That same day, Truk reburied her in the coffin she had been in over 3 months ago. This story is nearly a century old. My grandmother was only 13 at the time. She passed away 25 years ago at the age of 87. Anyone who lived in Nha Trang before 1975 would know that the road from Ninh Hoa to Nha Trang was sparsely populated, especially the middle section of this route. This was particularly true for the area near Nha Trang, with the rocky mountains of the Truong Son Range on one side and the vast deep sea on the other. The land was barren and white, with even wild plants struggling to grow, let alone crops. The ground and mountain slopes were covered with low, dense shrubs. Occasionally, one could see a few patches of the slopes cleared for banana cultivation, perhaps the only plant that could withstand the harsh and arid conditions of the land and weather here. Along the road, of trees. These houses were typically surrounded by banana groves, and in front, there were trellises for dragon fruit to climb. Dragon fruit was also a specialty of this dry land. Anyone who disliked the dampness of the rainy season might enjoy living in the dry climate of Nha Trang. Huang taught at Lê Quy Đôn High School, a well-known school in this central region. On holidays or Sundays, he often took his wife to visit various scenic spots to relax and unwind after a long work week. Moreover, as a young couple, they had no children to worry about. His wife was also a teacher at an elementary school in the city. They both loved to travel during their days off and were well matched in their interest. In the past, Vietnamese people worked 6 days a week. Recently, it has changed to 5 days a week. Hoang and his wife decided to visit the hot springs in Duc My. The hot springs were located near National Highway 21, so visitors didn't have to trek through forests or cross streams. The trip was delightful. The hot springs were formed by underground water sources that spouted through rock crevices, making the water very hot. Like other visitors, they bought chicken eggs to cook in the hot springs and waited for them to be ready to eat. Engrossed in their activities and sightseeing, it was not until 6 p.m. that they started heading back to Nha Trang. By the time they reached Ninh Hoa, it was almost 7 p.m. They decided to stop at a restaurant for dinner before continuing their journey. After finishing their meal, it was nearly 9 p.m. Hoang drove slowly to enjoy the cool evening breeze blowing in from the East Sea. Since the next day was Sunday, they weren't in a hurry to get home. Around 10 p.m., the sky was filled with twinkling stars and the road was deserted, except for Hoang and his wife's vehicle. The gentle breeze was refreshing, and they chatted about their trip, occasionally laughing out loud in enjoyment. When they were about 5 kilometers from Ru Ri Pass, the vehicle suddenly made a few sputtering sounds and then stopped. Hoang tried to kickstart it, but the Honda only made a few more noises before falling silent. He got down to the spark plug and wiring and tried again, but the vehicle remained stubbornly still. Looking around, there wasn't a house in sight. Leading the bike over 10 kilometers back home seemed impossible, especially since all repair shops were closed at this hour. With no other option, Hoang began pushing the bike along the roadside towards Nha Trang, where the lights illuminated the entire sky. Hoang was leading the bike along when he suddenly heard his wife shout, "Honey, there's a house up ahead!" He followed her pointing finger and saw the twinkling light coming from a house by the roadside. He asked his wife to bring out some tea for their guests. The old couple looked frail, but had kind faces. They asked why Hoang and his wife were wandering at night. Hoang explained their situation and asked if they could rest a bit before continuing their journey. The old man said, "It's already past 10 p.m., and if you push the bike to Nha Trang, you might not arrive until morning. Why don't you stay here for the night and leave in the morning? It's not too late." Hoang, already apprehensive about Ru Ri Pass, especially with the rumors of wandering spirits there, agreed to stay for the night, not wanting to risk exhaustion. The old couple offered their wooden bed in the main room to Hoang and his wife, while they moved to sleep on a bamboo mat in the kitchen. Exhausted from their outing, Hoang and his wife fell asleep immediately. They were awakened by the sound of roosters crowing nearby. Hoang checked his watch. It was 5 a.m. He woke his wife, and they washed up quietly, careful not to disturb the elderly couple, whose bed was still curtained off. He placed it on the wooden table and covered it with a teacup to prevent it from blowing away. He told his wife, "The old couple probably isn't well off. Consider this as payment for their kindness." He then led the bike out to the road and tried the engine. Fortunately, it started smoothly, as if nothing had been wrong. Hoang and his wife rode slowly, enjoying the cool early morning breeze. When they reached Dongdae Market, Hoang stopped at an early open cafe. He ordered a milk coffee for his wife and a black coffee for himself. Suddenly, his wife exclaimed in surprise, "Why are your clothes covered in soot on the back?" Hoang turned to look and saw his back covered in black soot. He laughed. "You too, not just me." They began brushing off the soot, puzzled about how it had gotten there. The cafe owner, who had just brought out their coffee, saw them and remarked, "I bet you stayed at that house across the pass, didn't you?" "Yes, how did you know?" Hoang asked in surprise. "Well, that's it then. We've been invited to spend the night by 2 burnt ghosts again." Hoang's wife asked, "These 2 burnt ghosts?" The cafe owner calmly recounted, "Well, it happened that last year, the house of the old couple across Ru Ri Pass burned down in the middle of the night. They were asleep and died in the fire. Since they had no relatives, they were buried right behind the burned-down house. Since then, occasionally people have been invited to spend the night there, only to wake up finding themselves lying on the floor of that burned-out house. Perhaps you woke up early and didn't realize you were lying on that floor. Hong's wife turned pale, murmuring prayers repeatedly. Hong, however, wasn't entirely convinced by the story. After finishing their coffee, he turned the bike back towards Ruri Pass. His wife, terrified, urged him to return to Nha Trang, but Hong insisted on heading towards Ruri Pass without faltering. After a while, he felt his wife grip his shoulder tightly, her voice trembling. "Look, it's true. Look, there's the burned house. Please, let's turn back." Without a word, Hong steered the bike straight to the burnt house, ignoring his wife's frozen figure behind him. He parked the bike and went inside. His face turned pale as he saw the wooden table, burnt halfway, with the 500 dong note still lying there, held down by a cup stained with black soot. The 500 dong note fluttered in the strong wind, almost as if reminding Hong and his wife that their overnight stay was indeed real and the cafe owner's story was not a fabrication. Hong and his wife were living this truth. Beyond the banana trees, 2 graves lay deserted, overgrown with weeds. Hong, being a teacher, felt a sense of duty. He told his wife to take the 500 dong note from the table and drive back to Dongdae Market to buy incense and some fruits. He, on the other hand, rolled up his sleeves and cleared the weeds from the graves. When Hong's wife returned with the incense and fruits, the graves had been cleaned. The couple placed the fruits in front of the graves and lit the incense sticks, planting them in the ground. Hong whispered to his wife, "They're pitiful. Without any children, there's no one to pay their respects. If we ever pass by here again, I think we should stop and burn incense." Afterward, Hong and his wife drove back home, feeling a sense of peace for having done something good for others. The following week, strange things began happening in their house. Every night they heard mysterious noises coming from the kitchen and the living room. Hong's wife, being a lighter sleeper, was often awakened by these sounds. As a woman, she dared not investigate, lying awake in fear, nor did she dare wake her husband for fear of being accused of being timid. However, as the noises persisted every night, one Sunday morning she boldly said to her husband, "Have you heard the strange noises in our house every night?" Hong, nonchalant, asked, "What noises?" "The sounds of something moving in the kitchen and the living room." Hong chuckled. "Oh, it's just some mice rummaging for food. I'll buy some mouse traps to set up tonight, and that'll solve it." So that day, Hong bought 3 mouse traps and set them up for his wife. But to no avail. The mysterious noises continued every night. One night, Hong's wife woke up feeling the urge to use the restroom. Despite her fear, she didn't want to wake her husband to accompany her. She slipped on her shoes and made her way to the kitchen. Hong sat up abruptly at the sound of his wife's piercing scream. Not finding her in bed, he rushed to the living room, but she wasn't there either. He ran downstairs to the kitchen, where he found his wife lying unconscious on the floor, a puddle of water around her. Hong picked her up and applied medicated clothes, and after a while, she regained consciousness, though her eyes still seemed dazed, darting around as if searching for something. After much coaxing, she finally fully awoke and burst into tears. It took a while before she was able to tell Hong what happened. "I felt the urge to pee and went to the kitchen. But when I got there, I saw an old lady from the burnt house standing by the stove, boiling water. When she turned to look at me, I got so scared that I screamed and fainted." Hong didn't quite believe his wife's words, thinking she was traumatized by the night they spent at the burnt house, causing her mental instability. But to reassure his wife, he gently said, "Rest now, okay?" That night passed without any further incident. The following night, as Hong slept, his wife woke him up, whispering in his ear, "Did you hear the sound of a play being performed in the living room?" Hong listened intently and indeed heard the sound of a play in the living room. He began to believe his wife's words. As a man, however, he wasn't terrified like his wife. He crawled out of bed and tiptoed to the living room. To Hong's utter disbelief, Sitting on two chairs were the old couple from the burnt house. They were leisurely sipping tea with a serene demeanor, their eyes fixed on Huang. Though he felt goosebumps, Huang managed to muster the courage to ask, "Yes, we are, dear. We apologize for bothering you," the old man replied. "Why have you come back here?" "It was too cold there, so we decided to come here for warmth. Besides, we saw that you and your wife are kind-hearted people, so we thought you wouldn't mind us. But my wife is very scared of your presence in this house, especially as she's a woman and quite superstitious." The elderly couple seemed concerned, and after a while, the old man spoke up. "We apologize for disturbing your wife. Since you two are compassionate, we ask for one favor. Can you please arrange a memorial service for us? We haven't found peace yet, and only with a proper service can we move on. I promise we will hold a memorial service for you this weekend. Though, can you tell me why you died unjustly? Who caused your deaths?" That night, as we slept in our house, a cross-provincial bus passed by. The driver carelessly tied the cargo, smoked, and threw the cigarette butt towards the roadside. Unfortunately, it landed on our roof, setting it on fire. We were asleep and perished in the flames. While it was an accident and the driver didn't intend to burn down our house, we still haven't found peace. Please remember to arrange the memorial service for us. After hearing this, the elderly couple slowly faded away. Keeping their promise, Hong and his wife went to the temple to invite the monks to perform a memorial service at the grave of the old couple. From then on, no one was invited to stay overnight at the burnt house. The tranquility returned to Hong's home as it was before. Occasionally, when passing by, Hong and his wife still stopped by to light incense and remove the overgrown weeds on the graves. Hong went even further. Several years later, he arranged for someone to renovate the graves, gather the ashes, and send them to a nearby temple. He said to his wife, "Since we've done them a favor, let's do it properly." River, also known as the Lam River, a large river in Huanzhou. It passes through Daidong, Dongluan, flows past Sanam Camp, and the Futhak Pier before emptying into the sea. The currents are fierce, with deep abysses everywhere, especially in the areas belonging to Daidong and Dongluan villages. In these ravines, there are densely populated hamlets. People often see women coming to the market to buy and sell goods, speaking in an urban manner. However, as they approach the riverbank, they disappear. One day, a local went down to the Dongluan Pier to wash his hands. As he stood there cooling off in the breeze, he saw two people riding horses gallop around 3 times before plunging. Castles emerged in the middle of the river, towering majestically and bustling with activity. Suddenly, he shouted, and immediately the castles sank. Then 2 headless giant fish emerged at the riverbank, turning the water red. Ding Quan from Daidong village served as a magistrate. Once, he visited the Raika Pier in Haidong and encountered an old woman selling goods, about 60 years old. She asked him, "Are you from Daidong village?" Ding Quan replied, "That village is thousands of miles away. How would you know?" The old woman chuckled. "Daidong is where I used to play when I was young. You didn't know that, did you?" Upon further questioning, she said, "Jiang Dong Ho, when I bathed in the river as a child. After 3 years here, Ho took me to work in Dongluan, guarding the Daidong abyss. Besides tending to household chores, I often went to the market for leisure. It's been many years since then. Ah, the descendants of Tiao Wei and Li Cheng are still there, aren't they? They were prominent figures in the village. Tiao Wei had a daughter who drowned. She also talked about Donglit Pond in Namdung district, quite far from the river, where boats couldn't pass through. According to tradition, there was a short whirlpool, considered sacred. One day, a water salt merchant from Hengwin district was sailing from Huanzhou Pier. It was the summer season, the water was high, and the merchant had finished selling his goods but couldn't sail back yet. One day, he saw 3 or 4 men who brought wine and meat to have a feast with him. During the meal, they handed him a letter and said, "I am a retainer of the deity of Donglit Pond. The deity is battling Tanvian Mountain and has abandoned me. Please deliver this letter to Dongluan Abyss for me." The boatman agreed, turned the boat southward, and sailed swiftly like an arrow, covering thousands of miles. By nightfall, they had reached Dongluan. Here, the boatman knocked on the boat and called out. He heard a faint sound underwater and then received the letter. He instructed the boatman to wait there. After a while, cries echoed in the air. Late at night, 2 soldiers climbed onto the boat with a small box containing 20 taels of gold as a token of gratitude. The boatman declined. "Please continue to bless the river, which has already bestowed many favors upon me. I dare not accept this gold." He only accepted the box and returned the gold. From then on, he traveled far and wide across the land, encountering no misfortune in his lifetime. This story is recorded based on the accounts of the elderly, so the accuracy cannot be guaranteed. It happened almost 90 years ago. During the French colonial period around 1920 to 1925, no one in Tainan province hadn't heard of the female demon on the ga tree in the courthouse area. The phenomenon occurred daily at noon, casting a chilling spell when the nights were silent. It often sang lullabies on the tree, sending shivers down the spine. At that time, there was a small round house built against the base of the go tree as a guest house for court officials to sit and read wine. Both guests and hosts were often disturbed by the enchanting singing from the tree, which was eerie and terrifying to hear. Sometimes the demon appeared as a beautiful young girl wandering on the road, luring any young man who fell for her charm into madness or even death. Particularly, the students in the province were terrified of the demon at the courthouse. They avoided passing through this area alone at night and would only venture in groups of 5 or 10. The reign of terror caused by the female demon stirred up great anxiety in the province. Especially, parents admonished their children every day not to laugh or mock anyone they met on the road, especially young women, and to return home quickly to avoid the appearance of the demon. One day, while the usual singing lulled the courthouse to sleep, the judge, annoyed, sent the guards to blow western trumpets to scare it away, but it was in vain. Out of anger, the judge climbed the tree and fired 3 shots in a row. Suddenly, a black smoke rose from the tree and disappeared into the nearby well, and since then, no one heard the singing as before in this area. A few days later, people heard the singing coming from a dao tree at the well. Since the demon moved to the well, it often possessed the body of a young rural girl who claimed to have lived on the ancient go tree outside the courthouse before. Now, due to the judge's punishment, she was injured and had to move to a new home, the Dao Ma Nu. Y was a demon in the Chu dynasty who was struck by lightning and transformed into a magical being that even thunder could not defeat. He traveled far and wide to cause mischief until encountering me, after which Y submitted to the 3 refuges. Now Y has reformed, so don't be afraid of Y. Even if Y comes here, Y won't harm anyone. About 27 years ago, on February 20th, 1945, I was in northeast China, Manchuria, at Mr. Chow's house. There was a moral virtue society in this area, where moral teachings were delivered daily. Some disciples had taken refuge with me, so whenever I passed by, I would stay there for a few days. After staying for a few days, I met a fortune teller whose name I didn't know. Why was he called a Fibatu? It means he predicts based on the year, month, day, and hour of birth. He used this method to make predictions for people. He told me, "Your destiny indicates you should be an official, so why did you become a monk? If you were to be an official, you would become a high-ranking one." I replied, "I have no intention of being an official, nor do I know how to be one. How could I possibly become one? I know how to become a monk, so now I am a monk." He said, "That's a pity." Then he read my palm and said, "At the very least, you can attain the highest position in the provincial examination." I responded, "Even if I were at the bottom, I have no ambition to be at the top." He continued, "This year you will encounter a lot of luck. Everything will go smoothly for you." I asked, "What will go smoothly?" He replied, "After the 10th day of next month, you will be different from now." I inquired, "How will I be different?" He explained, Right now, within 1,000 miles, many people believe in you. After the 10th day of next month, people beyond 10,000 miles will also believe in you. I questioned, how is that possible? He said, at that time, you will become enlightened. I arrived at Tung Bak Ki Tudon village to stay with my disciple named Haton Tung, who was over 60 years old. In his house, there were more than 30 people engaged in extensive farming. He was arguably the wealthiest landowner in the village, but had never believed in Buddhism or anything else. However, when he saw me arrive, he believed and took refuge in the Three Jewels. Not only did he take refuge, but his whole family also wanted to take refuge. Therefore, his entire family took refuge as well. Every time I passed by, I stayed at his house. His family of over 30 people was very happy to see me. I stayed for about 10 days, during which about 12 more people came to take refuge. I rode in Haton Tung's car back to Songtan district, which was more than 20 miles away. We had to depart at 3 in the early morning. The weather at that time was nearing spring, but it was unbearably cold. The driver and the others were all dressed in leather clothes and boots, while I, being too poor, had only 3 layers of rough fabric on, 2 layers for pants, and sandals without socks. My 2 palms pressed together, barely covering my ears, similar to the hat worn by Tae Kong. We departed at 3 in the morning and didn't arrive until now. By the time we reached the town, it was already bright. The driver and the others thought I had died from the cold because I wasn't adequately dressed. They stopped the car to move around, running to prevent numbness from the cold, while I remained in the car since the beginning of the journey. When we arrived at the eastern gate of Songtan district, the car stopped, and when I got off, the driver said, "We thought you had died from the cold." I stayed with friends and lay disciples for more than 10 days. On March 9th, I returned to Tung Bak Ki Tudon village at Haton Tung's house. When he told me that Havon Sun's daughter, who had recently taken refuge with me, was seriously ill. She had not eaten or spoken for 6 days and seemed angry and aggressive, as if she wanted to hit someone. Her mother said to me, "Master, our daughter, who just took refuge with you a few days ago, is ill. Her condition is very serious. She doesn't eat or speak, and she rolls her eyes, banging her head on the bed. We don't know what illness she has." I replied, "I can't cure her. I'm useless when it comes to diagnosing illnesses. Currently, there is a disciple who took refuge with me named Han Kung Kat. He has the ability to see the past, present, and future. You can ask him." Han Kung Kat also took refuge on February 24th. Before he took refuge, I didn't want to accept him. Before I became a monk, we were close friends and worked together in the Moral Development Society. After becoming a monk, Han Kung Kat gained the ability to see the past. He said, "Originally, you have been my master throughout lifetimes. Therefore, I want to take refuge with you." I said, "I can't accept you as a disciple. We've always been good friends, so why should I accept you as a disciple?" He replied, "If you don't accept me, I will be lost in this life." After saying that, he knelt down, determined to take refuge, but I was determined not to accept him. After a little over half an hour, I asked him, "Anyone who takes refuge with me must obey my teachings. Now that you have the ability to hear it and won't listen to my instructions," he said, "Master, I will obey. Even if you tell me to jump into boiling oil or walk on fire, I will do it. Even if it means death, I won't hesitate." I said, "Really? Is there anything I ask you to do in the future that you won't do?" He said, "Whatever Master commands me to do, I will do it, even if it's dangerous." Han Kung Kat was one of the 12 people who took refuge on February 24th. Upon hearing that my disciple was ill, I asked him, "You know how to diagnose people's illnesses. Now that this disciple is sick, can you take a look?" He sat in meditation, using his spiritual insight to assess the situation. Suddenly, his face turned pale with fear, and he said to me, "Master, this is bad. This situation is beyond my capabilities. I'm worried." I asked, "Why? What's wrong?" He said, "This is a demon, a very dangerous forms into a human to harm people and disrupt the world." I asked, "Why is it so dangerous? Tell me more." He said, This demon was born during the Chu dynasty. During that time, it was a demon because it didn't adhere to moral principles. It was destroyed by someone with virtue and divine power, shattered by lightning. However, its spiritual nature wasn't completely extinguished, so it later regrouped and transformed back into a demon. This demon now possesses immense supernatural abilities, able to transform and appear at will. Because it was struck by lightning, it later practiced a form of magic. This magic counters lightning. How does it work? It uses a... This thin membrane becomes the black hat. When worn, lightning can't harm it because lightning detests gloom. Westerners believe that lightning can't be controlled. Typically, lightning can't be controlled, but in special cases, lightning can be used to punish evil spirits in the mortal world. It has cultivated the black hat to resist lightning strikes. It has also cultivated two other forms of magic, two small round balls. When it wears the hat on someone, that person's soul is held captive, becoming its servant. As for the two round balls, whoever is hit by them dies instantly. Upon seeing such a dangerous demon, Han Kung Kat said to me, "Master, this is not good." I asked, "How is the illness?" He said, "It's terminal. There's no way to treat it." I said, "Terminal? Impossible. If she hadn't taken refuge with me, I wouldn't be concerned. She just took refuge with me on February 24th, not long ago." At the time of her refuge, I led them in reciting the Great Compassion Mantra. I said, "Each of you should learn the Great Compassion Mantra. It will be useful in the future. When you encounter danger, recite the Great Compassion Mantra and Bodhisattva Kuan Yin will protect you." Many people recite the Great Compassion Mantra, I said. If she hadn't taken refuge with me, the demon could do whatever it wanted with her. But since she has taken refuge with me, I can't let the demon take her life. I must intervene. He said, "Master, if you're concerned for her, then I won't go. I can't go with you." I said, "What? When you took refuge, you said you wouldn't hesitate to jump into the fire. Now, why are you refusing?" He didn't say anything, pondered for a while, then said, "Master, you must send some Dharma protectors." I said, "Just go if you're going. What's with the fuss?" He listened to me and didn't dare to act up. He followed me. When we reached the patient, she was lying on the bed with her head on the pillow and her buttocks in the air, looking very uncomfortable and angrily glaring, especially when she saw me. I asked the patient's family about the cause of the illness. They explained that 8 days ago, there was a middle-aged woman sitting next to a grave outside the village. She wore a dark blue dress, yellow pants, and shoes, and she was crying beside the grave. Hearing her cries, an elderly woman from the Ha family came to console her, but the woman continued to cry, saying, "Oh, my dear." She cried on one side and looked at her one on the other. The elderly woman continued to console her until she stopped crying, and the two of them returned to the village. Because there was a deity guarding the village, the woman didn't dare to enter. The village was surrounded by walls on 3 sides with gates on each side. The elderly woman from the Ha family went into the village, leaving the woman outside to cry. At that time, Ha Tontung's horse returned to the village. When it reached the village, the horse saw the woman and rushed in, terrified because the horse recognized the object immediately. Humans, on the other hand, did not recognize it. When the horse rushed in, the woman followed. Perhaps the deity guarding the village was startled to see the run in. The woman ran into Mr. Vu Trungbao's house and continued to look for her loved one. She looked at Mr. Vu and then ran out of the house. About 30 or 40 people surrounded her and asked, "What's your name?" She said, "I don't have a name." They asked again, "What's your family name?" She said, "I don't have a family name. I am a dead person." They stared at her as if she were a monster. She took off her black hat and left. She looked like she didn't know anything, walked to the wall of Mr. Havansun's house, which was about 3 feet high. She went to the wall, passed the hat through the wall, and then jumped over the wall in one leap. The wall was so high that probably no one could jump over it, but martial arts skills, so the whole crowd ran over to see her. Havansun's son, Haton Tuan, who also took refuge with me on the 24th, ran in from the door and said, "Mom! Mom! The crazy woman is here. Don't be afraid." His mother looked out the window but didn't see anything strange. When she turned back, she saw the woman crawling into bed, lying half up and half down. She asked the woman, "Who are you looking for? Who are you looking for?" The woman didn't say anything. Seeing the woman's gestures were very strange, she and her daughter recited the great compassion mantra, just finishing the first sentence. Namo Harera Datana Darada. The woman lay motionless on the ground, resembling a corpse. Seeing this was not good. It wouldn't be right if she died inside the house. So I went to report to the village chief. The village chief, seeing the woman lying on the ground as if dead, used his hands to lift her and carried her outside the courtyard, asking her, "Where are you from? And why are you here?" She replied, "Don't ask me. I am a dead body. I have no name, no family, and no home. Wherever I go, I stay there." Hearing her words, the village chief was also frightened. He took her out of the village about 50 bo, a unit of length, away and returned to the village. He found her behind him, so he took her farther away, about 10 bo this time, yet she followed him back again. Finally, he and 3 other men took her even farther, about 150 bo away, and said, "Go! If you don't, I'll shoot." And they fired 2 warning shots. The woman fell to the ground in fear, thinking the gunshots were thunder that had killed her earlier. This time, she did not return with them to the village. When the village chief and the men returned, they heard that Havanson's daughter was ill. She neither spoke, nor ate, nor slept, just lay on the bed, staring blankly, with her head on the pillow and her buttocks in the air, having eaten or drunk nothing for 8 days. Before going to Mr. Havanson's house, said to Hankung Cat, "I'm telling you, if we get involved in this, we'll die. I'd rather die than let my disciples who have taken refuge with me die. First, we must save those who have taken refuge with us. We can't let them die without worrying. Second, we have to save this demon. I said no one can control it, but it has committed many sins. Someone will surely be able to subdue it. It has been practicing for many years. If we destroy it, it will be a pity. Even if it intends to kill me, I must save her. Third, we must save all sentient beings in the world. If we can't subdue it, it will harm many more people in the future. For these reasons, we must go." So, when we arrived at the patient's house, the village chief also arrived. During our discussion, he realized that the woman was a ghost and said, "It's a pity that day I lifted her with my hands without using any strength, as if there was nothing there. If you hadn't said anything, I wouldn't have thought about it. Now I know she's a ghost." We had to find a way to subdue her. How could we do it? In the Lankavatara Sutra, there are 5 types of dharmas. Among the 5 types, there are the dharma to dispel calamities, which can be used to avoid any disaster. The dharma of sand, to transform any situation that isn't smooth into something smooth. The dharma of summoning, to catch any demon, no matter how far away it is. There are such dharmas. So I used the Lankavatara Sutra to summon Nyugen Yimanu, emanating from her. Anyone who smelled it would vomit. When she came in, she tried to put the hat she had trained on my head, but it didn't work. Her hat was useless, so she threw the round balls at me, but they also missed. She tried both methods of magic, but they were ineffective, useless. She knew she had run out of options and wanted to flee. However, there was no escape, no matter which way she... When she entered, I had already initiated the prohibition, as if I had set up a formation, so she had no way out. Above, below, front, back, left, right, all directions were guarded by heavenly dragon gatekeepers, and she couldn't escape. With no other choice, she knelt down and wept. I then preached the Dharma of the 12 Nidanas and the 6 Paramitas to her. She understood and wanted to take refuge in the triple gem, generating the Bodhi mind. I accepted and took refuge for her, giving her the name Kim Kang Yugen Nu. After taking refuge, she always followed me to help sentient beings. However, her habitual tendencies were demonic. Wherever I went, there was always a foul stench. Seeing this, I asked her to go to Mount La in Jiaoha district, Katlum province, to cultivate. Why is it called the Vantunlin Long Cave? I have many peculiar disciples who have taken refuge. I have sent them all there to cultivate. I have also been there myself. After some time, she gained some spiritual abilities and often went to various places to save people. However, she did not want others to know how she saved them. Therefore, doing good deeds and wanting people to see is not true goodness. Doing evil deeds and fearing people knowing is great evil. If you do good deeds and want others to know, it is not true goodness. If you do evil deeds and fear others knowing, it is very evil. So, Nguyen Yuma eventually became a Tunlin long cave because there are 3 entrances to the cave where you can see through to the other side. This mutual clarity is why it is called Lin Long, like a glass that allows you to see what's inside. Therefore, it is not necessarily about glass. Rather, it means that you can see through from the inside to the outside and vice versa. This cave has 3 entrances that are all interconnected. Inside, there is a temple. The materials to build this temple were transported by goats. A goat could carry 2 roof tiles or a wooden beam at a time because the mountain was too high. Outside the cave, to the west, is the Lao Tu Cave, and to the east is the Tich Thui Cave. Inside the Tich Thui Cave, drops of water are enough for myriad beings to drink. Behind the cave is the Ki To Cave, also known as the Ki Hyodung Cave. Ki Hyodung is also from my hometown in northeast China. He has subdued 5 demons on this mountain and also subdued the Black Fish Spirit. The Black Fish Spirit was a high-ranking official in the Ming Dynasty in Beijing. His surname is Huck, but he is not human. He is a fish. Ki Hyodung knew he would pass through this mountain, so he waited there. When he passed by, Ki Hyodung used his staff to strike and kill the Black Fish Spirit. Therefore, nobody knows exactly how many caves are on that mountain. Today, you might know there are 12 caves. Tomorrow, there might be 13. And the day after tomorrow, there might be more or just 12 again. Once someone went up the mountain and saw 2 old men playing chess. When he shouted, the 2 old men with long beards looked up and said to each other, "Why did he come up here? The natural stone door is closed." He knelt there praying until he died. Now his tomb is still outside the stone cave door. See, people pray, plead, and kneel there until they die, but they never get up. Therefore, that mountain has many spirits. I met someone named Li Min Phuc. He was skilled in martial arts and ran as fast as a monkey. One day, I arrived there in the early morning, around 4 o'clock, and climbed up the mountain. I saw him worshiping the Buddha. His hair was tied tightly behind, weighing about 3 to 4 kilograms, and he had a bamboo hat on his head. He had never bathed. His figure was very small but incredibly strong, while 8 people could only carry 1 iron rod. No one knew his age, where he came from, or when he entered. He was a strange person that I met there. What I just told you is not a legend, not a fabrication, but the truth, a true event. Whether you believe it or not is up to you. My mother was someone who hated superstitions, ghosts, demons, and fortune-telling. However, such incidents happened to my mother. I had a younger sister, the 4th child in the family, who died at the age of 12. Interestingly, her death date coincided perfectly with the year, month, day, and hour of her birth. After she died for several years, she suddenly returned and entered my mother's body, frightening everyone. In times, the family gradually got used to it and was no longer afraid. When she returned, she explained that she was from the higher realm and, due to karmic affinity, had incarnated into our family. After being with us for exactly 12 years, her karmic affinity ended, so she returned to the higher realm. Now, to create merit for sentient beings, she returned to the mortal world, borrowing my mother's body to save people. I remember every time she returned like that, she burned a bundle of red-hot incense sticks, then held the burning incense over her hands and face, of course, through my mother's body, yet after she left, my mother suffered no burns or injuries. Initially, she only helped family treating my mother's heart disease. My mother had a severe heart condition, and every doctor was at a loss. Her heart condition was so severe that just someone speaking loudly or dropping something nearby was enough for my mother's condition, asserting that she couldn't live more than a year without a heart transplant. That was in 1969 when my family was in Nha Trang. Yet, It's been over 35 years since then, and after my younger sister returned to heal my mother, she continued to live. My younger sister returned and used mineral incense in cold water, instructing that my mother should drink it immediately after she left her body. After doing so several times, she also instructed the family to go to the fields, gather wild plants, including stems, branches, and leaves, chop them into small pieces, dry them, and then make tea from them instead of regular tea every day. Following her instructions at home, my mother's heart condition gradually improved. When the doctors re-examined her, they were surprised because they had previously diagnosed her as beyond saving without a heart transplant. Gradually, neighbors learned about it and started coming to our house, praying for my younger sister to return and cure their illnesses. The whole family was distressed. Every afternoon, after finishing dinner, the neighbors and even those from far away gathered at our house. My father, mother, and siblings didn't want to be disturbed after a hard day's work, but with the daily visits from relatives, it became unbearable. Once my younger sister returned, it would take hours for the crowd to disperse, and it was always late at night before we could sleep. However, with the instant pleas, my mother had no choice but to let them in. Sometimes, my father had to light incense and beg my younger sister not to return, but she kept coming back to treat countless patients, using simple methods like mineral incense in cold water or ordinary plants. Surprisingly, almost all patients recovered without paying a penny, and my younger sister vehemently refused to accept any money. Some insisted on leaving money, but my younger sister fiercely rejected it all. Around 1969 to 1970, my family on Hung Vuong Street, Nha Trang, became quite famous for this. Later, my family moved to Saigon. My father bought a house in the To Hien Thanh housing complex near the Phu Thọ racetrack from a major in the Republic of Vietnam. The house was quite large, and he divided it in half, selling one part to my family. Both families maintained a friendly relationship and often interacted with each other. During this time, my younger sister occasionally returned. In 1973, while on a helicopter mission, the major was shot down by enemy forces. He passed away, leaving no instructions for his wife and children. A few months after his death, one night my younger sister returned through my mother's body again. After a brief exchange, she called the major's wife to come over for help. After the major's wife arrived, she asked her if she wanted her husband to come back to visit, but the woman was too scared to answer. We had witnessed strange occurrences many times before, so we weren't surprised. Therefore, the whole family urged her to ask my younger sister to bring her husband back for a visit. With mixed feelings, she asked my younger sister to try. She said it's okay, just wait. She would lead him back to meet them. After saying that, she left. After a while, the major returned through my mother's body. Saw his wife and children sitting in front of him, he burst into tears and then began to tell his story. That's when we realized it was him. What shocked everyone was that there were things only he and his wife knew, yet he revealed them through my mother's body at that time. Additionally, there was a story that happened right then, which I remember vividly. The major told his wife that he had hidden some money behind the wardrobe, something she didn't know about before. He urged her to go check if the money was still there. At the same time, if there was any alcohol left at home, she should bring it for him because he was craving it badly. When he was alive, he drank alcohol like a fish. His wife would not go home alone. She had to ask my sister, who was helping with household chores, to accompany her. After a while, she returned with a bundle of money carefully wrapped in newspaper and a bottle of Johnny Walker whiskey. She was so scared that her face turned pale and she could hardly walk. My sister had to support her. Then she poured the whiskey into a cup, and her husband urged her to pour more and more for him because he was so eager and might not have the chance to drink again. So, while crying and trembling, she poured the cup nearly full until we had to stop her. The major, through my mother's body, drank the whole cup of whiskey at once as if it were cold water. At that moment, I took a drop of alcohol. Right after finishing the cup, He suddenly looked very frightened, stammering that he had been reprimanded for drinking alcohol, as it was against the law and he couldn't stay long. He burst into tears, hugged his wife and children, and then suddenly disappeared. Immediately after that, my sister returned with an unprecedented anger and scolded the major's wife heavily. She said that during this time, he couldn't enjoy anything from the mortal world, and giving him alcohol was only harmful to him. She also said that before asking to visit his wife and children, he had been instructed very carefully not to enjoy anything, yet he still did it wrong. The wife and children pleaded desperately not to punish him. My whole family begged my younger sister to help. Still angry, she said this was beyond her capability, and she was also affected by it. Then, with lingering anger, she left. Long after she left, the whole family remained shocked and fearful. My mother returned to her normal self, unaffected by that glass of Johnny Walker whiskey. I even think that at the time, even I would have been knocked out if I drank it all at once. Another sacred story in our family involved my younger sister. It was so strange that if I hadn't witnessed it myself, I would have thought it was absurd. This time, it directly affected my wife and me. Around April 1973, just a few months after our marriage, one night my younger sister returned. Our family had become accustomed to this, so no one was scared anymore, except my wife. At that time, I was in the army, stationed in Phan Rang, and I rarely got leave. My wife accompanied me outside Phan Rang during my leave, and because of that, I brought her to visit my parents and siblings. Having been married for just a few months and rarely being around her husband's family this before, so she was very frightened when she saw my younger sister return through my mother's body, holding a bundle of burning red incense in her hand without being burned. Such a bizarre scene was too much for a young girl to handle. My wife was so scared that she pulled me to sit far away, not daring to sit close. After talking with the people around for a while, my younger sister suddenly pointed towards us and beckoned my wife to come closer. My wife was so frightened she couldn't move. My sisters and I had to reassure her. "Don't worry, just go ask Kim Mien." My younger sister's name when she was alive was Thu, but after she died and returned, she told us her name in the afterlife was Kim Mien, and hold my wife's hand and lead her to sit closer to calm her down. My younger sister looked at my wife for a while and asked her, "Do you know who Kim Mien is?" My wife hesitantly answered, "I don't know." She laughed. "Kim Mien is your sister. Don't you know? Look up at Kim Mien. She's here to help you, not to harm you. Don't be afraid." My wife reluctantly looked up. My younger sister then used the burning incense to gently touch my wife's face and fingers, calculating something silently for a long time without saying a word. The whole family waited anxiously, not knowing what was happening. After a while, she told my wife, "Kim Mien will help you with this. You must remember to follow Kim Mien's instructions. You'll buy a white lily branch for Kim Mien, just one branch, no need for more. When you get home, put it in a glass of cold water, place it on the table, and remember to say this: lily branch to you," calling out Kim Mien's name and saying these words 3 times, then wait until a lily blooms and falls, then take that flower, burn it to ash, grind it, mix it with cold water, and drink it all. Do you remember it well? My wife was too scared, not knowing what was happening, just nodding reluctantly. I was curious too, so I asked, "What's going on? Can Kim Mien tell us?" My younger sister couldn't answer, saying she would tell us later, but for now, we should follow her instructions. Then she turned to talk to others and said nothing more to my wife. My wife stayed up all night, too scared to sleep. The next day, she went to the market, bought a lily branch. All day, she sat watching for a falling lily, but the entire day passed without any blooms. I was annoyed because it was my rare day off, and my wife couldn't go out with me because of this. By the end of the day, still no falling lily. I remember around 5 p.m., our housekeeper was cooking in the kitchen. Suddenly, she called my wife for something. My wife went downstairs to the kitchen and returned upstairs shortly after, saying a lily had fallen onto the table out of nowhere. My wife was so scared, her face turned pale, and she screamed for me. I was lying on the hammock in front of the house and rushed in when I heard her scream. There were many lilies on the branch, but only one fell. My wife had been waiting all day without any blooms, and then it fell in a very short time when no one was there. It was truly strange. Then my wife followed the instructions, burning the lily to ash, grinding it, mixing it with cold water, and drinking it all. After a while, nothing happened. Initially, we kept an eye out, but gradually we forgot about it. I continued my military service, while my wife, now heavily pregnant, stayed in Saigon with her family for her mother to take care of her. At the end of 1973, my wife accidentally fell down the stairs, and her pregnancy was impacted severely. She was rushed to Hung Vuong Hospital for emergency treatment. After that, she gave birth prematurely. The fetus was only about 6.5 months old. I was informed at home and immediately applied for leave. When I visited my wife at Hung Vuong Hospital, she had already given birth. My first child, a daughter, was born too weak and had to be kept in an incubator for special care. However, less than 24 hours later, my daughter passed away. My family and I knew about this sad event, but to reassure my wife, I just said that our child was still healthy, but because she was born prematurely, the doctors needed to give her special care. The next day, when I visited my wife in the hospital, I met the doctor who had helped deliver my wife in the emergency room. She told me that in her over 20 years of experience in obstetrics, she had never encountered a case as strange as my wife's. Curious, I asked what was so unusual about my wife's case. The doctor explained that while assisting my wife's delivery, she discovered that my wife had 2 placentas. One was for the baby girl who had been born, while the other had shriveled up. 2 placentas indicated a twin pregnancy, but in this case there was only one baby, and the other placenta did not develop. It was perplexing how the underdeveloped placenta did not affect the first one or the normal development of the baby girl. I listened to her explanation but didn't pay much attention. My mind was still reeling from the loss of our first child and my wife's illness. I couldn't focus on what the doctor was saying. After my wife recovered from the danger, the doctor discharged her from the hospital. Life gradually returned to normal after the recent sorrowful episode. Once my wife's health improved, I took her back to our unit to resume our lives as before. Almost everyone had forgotten about a few months ago. In early 1974, when I was on leave, my wife and I visited my parents. That night, my younger sister returned home. This time, she beckoned my wife forward with a smile and said, "Do you know that Kim Mien saved you?" My wife and our family were astonished, not understanding what my younger sister meant. She then recounted the previous incident and informed us that when she spoke to my wife a year ago, she already knew that my wife was pregnant with twins. At that time, my wife's body was very weak, and she knew that the pregnancy wouldn't be successful, but with my wife's frail condition, she wouldn't be able to bear losing a twin pregnancy. According to my younger sister, the pregnancies was threatened, but hadn't yet been recorded in the birth registry. So she attempted to terminate the threatened pregnancy to save my wife's life. However, she couldn't terminate both pregnancies because one had already begun to form, while the other was just a mass of blood without life. Thus, she performed the lily ritual to terminate the undeveloped pregnancy. Without it, my wife might not have survived. After my sister's explanation, I recalled the doctor's words at Hung Vuong Hospital and couldn't help but shudder. My family was overwhelmed with fear from this extraordinary tale. My wife asked my sister for protection to ensure we could have children, but given my wife's weakened state, my sister looked at us sadly and shook her head, saying, "Your destiny is heavy, and you have to pay a heavy price. Kim Mien will help you, but everyone has to pay their dues. Kim Mien will help you have grandchildren. Don't worry." Then she gently waved incense in front of my wife's face and said nothing more. Afterward, my wife suffered another miscarriage, despite our efforts to support and nurture her and the doctor's attentive care. Our second child could not be saved either. In 1975, my wife gave birth to our third child, a son, who, although premature, was healthy. Since then, my wife's health has improved significantly. Our daughter, born in 1980, has also been healthy. Although this was a long time ago, I still feel a shiver down my spine when writing about it. After 1975, my family, all belonging to the old regime, avoided the new economic policies. We bought a piece of land in the middle of the road to Long Khan in Hung Bin Hamlet, Hung Lak District, Dong Nai Province, with a garden of jackfruit, bananas, and other flowers for our livelihood. In 1978, I returned from re-education camp, penniless. My wife, our young son, and I moved in with my parents, living together and farming to get by. During this time, my younger sister often returned home to treat illnesses and acquaintances. Those who knew my sister from before spread the word, and soon many people, even from distant provinces, came seeking her help. Sometimes I became truly frustrated. Our home was poor, my father was still in prison, and yet so many people came asking for my sister's help. My mother and siblings had to wake up early, grab hoes, and work in the fields until late at night. After finishing dinner, before my mother could rest, sick people would come, begging for my sister's return to heal them. Although my mother sometimes felt too exhausted and tried to avoid it, she couldn't bear to disappoint people who had traveled far to seek help, especially since most of them were poor. In the end, my mother allowed them to light incense and call my sister back to treat them. One night, I came home drunk with my uncle to find a crowd surrounding my mother. At that moment, my sister had just returned through my mother's body. I was so angry and intoxicated that I pointed at my sister and scolded, "Without Kim Mien, there's no master or anything. We've been through so much hardship, and where did anyone help us with money or food? Mother has suffered all day, and now she's being tormented even more." In my drunken state, I continued to curse and say many more things, causing everyone in the house, including my wife and younger siblings, to look pale. My sister, who had just returned through my mother's body, looked up at me and shouted, "Kim Mien was your sister in the mortal world, but now she's in the realm above. She's no longer your sister. You can't treat Kim Mien like this." At that moment, I suddenly stiffened, unable to move or even lift my arms. I couldn't speak. If it were a martial arts story, I would have been like someone hit with a pressure point, standing frozen in one spot, unable to move at all. My sister was very angry, but she informed me that she wouldn't punish me. However, the spirits accompanying her were not so forgiving. They couldn't tolerate my unruliness and made me stiffen up. If my sister hadn't intervened, they would have taught me a lesson. At that moment, my soul seemed to vanish. All the alcohol in my body suddenly disappeared. I stood there petrified like a statue. I had never, still angry, said to me, "Why are you so ungrateful? If it weren't for Kim Mien saving you twice while you were in prison, would you still be standing here disrespecting Kim Mien like this? When you had edema, your feet swollen with yellow fluid flowing out in prison, why did you think of Kim Mien and call for help? If Kim Mien hadn't come to save you, would you still be alive? Furthermore, when you were pinned under a tree in the forest, act like you know nothing. Kim Mien came here, borrowing Mother's body, to create merits for sentient beings, but also for Mother and the family, creating merits for you and your sister. So why do you blame Kim Mien?" "Oh," she was shouting angrily, and the relatives and everyone in the house begged for my forgiveness. But I was too terrified to describe, drenched in cold sweat. Through her words, I vividly remembered the events when we were undergoing re-education after April 30th, 1975. First, we were sent to Tranglong Camp in Tainan. During this time, the Liberation Front's Military Management Committee controlled us. The rice they gave us was moldy, stored in damp cellars for years. One in the rice was gone. As a result, nearly all of us suffered from severe edema due to a lack of B1 in our bodies. At that time, we didn't receive proper medical care. They only gave each person a small B1 tablet daily when edema started to appear. But then the medicine ran out and the edema worsened. Many of us, including myself, had swollen limbs, shiny skin that looked very frightening. When we pressed our fingers on the skin, there would be deep holes looking extremely horrifying. What's worse, we couldn't lift our feet to walk. Every time we tried to stand up, we would fall down immediately. Some people were taken to the infirmary and died there. The news spread from those who carried the sick to the infirmary that being in just waiting to die, as there were no medicines there. So it was better to stay in the camp where we still had fellow inmates to help. My edema was very severe, my skin thin and sticky, with some places torn and oozing yellow fluid. At that time, I was truly miserable, unable to stand up and feeling like I would die. So I spent my days lying down, praying, and not wanting to eat or drink anything. During those prayerful moments, I prayed to my younger sister Mien several times, and gradually I recovered without knowing how, completely healed. I considered it fortunate and believed it was my karma. As time passed, I almost forgot about this. The second time, when we were transferred to Dongbang camp, surrounded by vast forests extending to the Cambodian border, one day we received orders to cut bamboo. The target set for each person was 2 long bamboo trees. After being transferred to Dongbang camp, we were not as strictly controlled as before. Every day we received daily work targets and just needed to complete them, regardless of how we did it. The forest we went to was extremely far away from our even 10 kilometers, because the nearby forests had been cleared for farming. When we reached the bamboo forest, it was almost noon. Everyone took a break, ate some boiled sweet potatoes they brought, then dispersed to find suitable bamboo to cut, aiming to return to camp before dark. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to find the way back in the darkness. After finding suitable bamboo clumps, we removed all the sharp thorns around and started cutting them horizontally at the roots. Then we would pull the bamboo down and strip off the small branches before cutting the tops. Since we, the reformed prisoners, had done this job many times, we were very experienced. No matter how thorny the bamboo clumps were, they couldn't cause us much trouble. I had cut the roots of 2 bamboo trees, but I couldn't pull them down because their tops kept getting tangled in the vines from other tall trees. It would be a waste of time to cut another bamboo tree, and starting over would mean returning late to camp. So I took a risk and followed the vines, climbing up a nearby tall tree intending to cut off its large branch to release the vines entangled with my bamboo tree. But that branch was decayed and weak, and I didn't know it. While sitting precariously on the thick branch, cutting the vines entangled with my bamboo tree, suddenly I heard a loud crack. The branch broke. I fell from a height with the whole big branch and numerous vines entangled around. Still see sunlight streaming through the leaves. I tried to crawl out from under the tangle of vines covering me, but I couldn't move my body at all. My whole body was damp and extremely painful every time I tried to shift my weight. I didn't know how I had fallen like that, with the big branch pressing down on me and the vines tangled all around me, and my axe was nowhere to be found. I shouted for help loudly, but besides my own echoing voice, I heard no response. Other comrades were either far away searching for good bamboo to cut, digging wild roots, or foraging for wild vegetables to improve our meager daily meals. I shouted until my throat was hoarse but heard no reply, feeling utterly desperate. Trying to free my leg from the tangle of vines, but the pain was unbearable. I started using both hands to pull each vine one by one, then forcefully threw it aside to create some space to wiggle out from under the mess of an. Unaware if I had any injuries or broken bones, my survival instinct drove me to figure out how to escape this predicament before dark fell. The fear made me numb to the pain, although I could feel my hands bleeding from scraping and pulling at the vines. In those desperate struggles, my mouth never ceased praying. I called out Kim Lian's name, my deceased sister revered in our family, begging for salvation. In the blur of time passing, in a dazed state, I vaguely felt my body could wriggle out from under the large branch, pinning me down. And from there, I managed to free myself from the tangled mess of vines around me. By now, intending to use it as support to follow the trail out of the bamboo forest. But with every step, my right leg throbbed in pain. I thought I had broken a bone in my leg, but after carefully feeling around, I realized it wasn't fractured. Nevertheless, the pain persisted, making it impossible to walk. I suspected I might have just sprained a bone in my right foot. Finally, crawling and inching forward, I managed to leave that vast bamboo forest behind. It took me a while longer to reach the main trail, the intersection where paths branched off to other forest areas for cutting bamboo, digging wild roots, or chopping trees. What we jokingly called the International Crossroads. Exhausted, I couldn't crawl any further. It was around 4 p.m., and despite my injuries, I was still about 8 kilometers away from our camp. I lay sprawled out on the trail, resigned to fate. After lying there for a while, I suddenly heard voices. I struggled to sit up and saw 6 people carrying bamboo coming towards me. They were fellow reformed prisoners from the neighboring camp, returning from cutting bamboo. Each of them carried a large load. Seeing me injured lying in the middle of the road, they stopped, gave me water to drink, then quickly fashioned a makeshift stretcher out of forest vines for me to sit on. 2 of them carried me, taking turns, tirelessly until we finally reached my camp, long after dark had fallen. After handing me over to the guard, another guard directed them back to their camp. I regret not having had the chance to meet those 6 comrades who rescued me and brought me safely back to camp so I could thank them properly. I also considered myself fortunate, always encountering benefactors wherever I went, without thinking much beyond that. That was the year 1977. About my younger sister, it was only after hearing her furious scolding that I was startled and shocked. I had never told anyone about my experience with edema and the forest accident, the fallen tree incident, not even my wife. So, to have my sister bring it up and claim she had saved me, it was chilling to say the least. Remembering the sensation of wriggling out from under that large branch entangled with vines, I found it truly miraculous. Despite numerous attempts before, I couldn't move an inch, but suddenly, I managed to escape that trap. Considering the height from which I fell and how the large branch pinned me without breaking any bones or causing death, it was indeed a strange occurrence. After a fit of anger, but if I ever dared to quarrel with her again, she would ignore me and have nothing to do with me anymore. Strangely, at that moment, my limbs started moving again. Just writing about it gives me goosebumps. I sat down on the ground, everyone gathered around, and I begged my sister for forgiveness. I was so shaken that I immediately apologized to my sister and confirmed to everyone present about my 2 previous prison accidents, even the inexplicable escape which I attributed to sheer luck, not knowing that Mien had intervened. Once everyone settled down during that same meal, I told Mien that my family was worried the local authorities would cause trouble for our family if she kept dubious activities and would incriminate various families, causing unnecessary trouble. My sister assured us that no one could cause trouble for our family, as even the families of local authorities would come to her for help. She told everyone to wait and see if her words were true and not to worry. The news of my sister's return to my mother to seek treatment indeed reached the local authorities. One morning, while we were in the field, someone came running to fetch my mother and me to Bin, saying there was trouble. True enough, as soon as we arrived at the Bin office, the village head immediately accused my mother and me of practicing superstition, selling charms, and engaging in dubious rituals or gathering herbs, claiming it was superstitious, and if she disobeyed, he would report us to the commune authorities. We returned home feeling disheartened. I told my mother we had to beg Mien not to return anymore. If she continued, one day the local authorities would surely come after us. My family did not want any trouble over this matter. My mother had already pleaded with Mien several times to let her rest, as it wasn't what she wanted. With my father still in prison and me having recently returned from reform, if the local thugs started bothering us, someone would end up dead immediately. Not a game to play around with. The next few days, anticipating potential trouble at any moment, when one evening the village head brought a young child to our house in a hurry. His wife carried a small child around 3 or 4 years old. We didn't know what was happening until she tearfully explained that her child was suffering from a strange illness, with ulcers all over the body and oozing yellow liquid. Despite seeking medical help from several doctors, the child's condition was worsening day by day. Some people advised the wife of the village head to bring her child to my mother for healing. My mother replied sincerely that she didn't know how to treat this illness. The wife of the village head said she had heard that my mother's daughter had some divine powers and often came to heal people, so she begged my mother to help her child. My mother replied, "The village head told me a few days ago that our family is superstitious and involved in dubious practices, and banned us from doing such things. Now why are you coming to beg us to bring my daughter home to heal your child? We dare not. We truly don't know how to treat this illness. Please go for your child." The wife of the village head and some relatives cried and pleaded endlessly, but to no avail, so they reluctantly took the child back home. About half an hour later, they returned, this time with the village head himself. He came forward to plead with my mother, saying that she shouldn't be angry because he had to fulfill his duty and had no intention of harming our family. He also asked around and found out that my sister's healing practices were entirely altruistic, without any solicitation for money from anyone. Therefore, he didn't report to the commune authorities. Unfortunately, his eldest child was seriously ill, and since no one could cure him, he begged my mother to bring my sister back to help. Even if the treatment failed, his family would still be grateful and promised not to cause any trouble for our family. His wife continued sobbing, adding to the dramatic scene. My mother was a kind-hearted woman. Whenever she saw someone crying and begging, she couldn't help but be moved, and if she could help, she would do so immediately. She couldn't stay angry at anyone for long. I could see my mother beginning to soften, and although I felt very resentful inside, I couldn't say anything. I just intervened to say to the village head, "This is your family's request, not ours. We don't want this. Later, don't blame us and label us as superstitious and involved in dubious practices." He and his wife kept saying, No, we will be grateful to your family for helping us. We would never harm your family." After that, my mother lit some incense, prayed earnestly, and a while later, my sister returned. She used some special incense on the child's body and then instructed the wife of the village head to go out into the fields the next day, pick 7 leaves of a certain plant, crush them, and apply them to the child's back and body. If done several times, the illness would be cured. It was as simple as that. With everything settled, my sister turned to the village head and asked if he dared to hold the burning incense close to his head. He replied fearfully, No, I dare not." My sister scolded, "Just hold it. There's nothing to be afraid of. You won't get burned." After finishing her words, she immediately pushed the burning incense toward his head. He was sitting there, startled, trying to move away, but my sister kept extending her hand. He hesitantly reached out into his hand. Strangely, he didn't get burned at all. My sister then said to him, "This family is an upright family, dedicated to doing good deeds, healing people without taking any money from anyone. We are not practitioners of black magic or charlatans trying to extort money from the people." After that, she warned him not to make trouble for my family. If he harmed us, he would see the consequences immediately. The village head and his wife, as well as some of his relatives, bowed profusely to my sister and promised to help my family easily in rescuing people in the future. A few days later, the village head and his wife brought fruits to offer to my family and informed us that their son's illness was caused by the illness had healed and the child could eat and sleep well again. Of course, after that, my family was no longer harassed. There's something I want to mention here about my father. Before 1975, my father was an Air Force non-commissioned officer with the highest rank of senior sergeant. Although his rank was only that of a non-commissioned officer, his English proficiency was excellent. He was one of the instructors at the Air Force English School of the Republic of Vietnam, training military personnel of all ranks, before they went abroad for study or training in the United States. Due to his duty, my father had the opportunity to train in the United States 3 times. In late April 1970, my father, mother, and my siblings were supposed to evacuate according to the list of the Air Force English School. At that time, the situation was very complicated, and many officers with the rank of lieutenant colonel couldn't take their families with them. It wasn't simply a matter of having a high rank and being able to evacuate whenever one wanted. Conversely, there were soldiers from the military police or lower-ranked personnel who worked in important positions and could easily leave. My father was one of the cases of low-ranking individuals, but with an upright family being included in the evacuation list. He had close friends working in the Defense Attaché office who helped put our family's name on the list of evacuees. The American officials at the Defense Attaché office put my family members on the list and set the date and time for departure. Unfortunately, after my father told my mother, she refused to go under any circumstances, citing many reasons to avoid leaving, like what would they do for a living there? Everyone in the family except my father would not know English. What about the family's ancestral graves here? How could they abandon them? Oh, there were plenty of reasons. Every day my parents argued about this matter, and in the end, my father had to give in and give up on going. Later, I learned the main reason my mother stubbornly refused to go was because of our upcoming baby. In those days, with guns roaring around, people in fear, my wife was about to give birth. My wife had suffered 2 miscarriages before, as I mentioned. This was the 3rd time. I was still stuck outside Phan Rang after my unit disbanded, not knowing whether I would live or die, so my mother couldn't bear to leave. My father couldn't take the family with him for evacuation, so it was really miserable for him. He knew staying behind would be difficult because even though he was a non-commissioned officer and wouldn't face re-education camps, he didn't know what to do with his history of going to the United States 3 times before. After 1975, I went through re-education camp. My father couldn't find any job. Every day, the community urged my parents to start a new business, which made my mother even more distressed. Therefore, after some my parents bought a piece of land in Hung Min Hamlet, Hung Lak Commune, as mentioned earlier. Then, my father left my mother and us to take care of farming while he traveled everywhere, trying to find a way to cross the border. During this time, the border crossing movement had started, though it wasn't very widespread yet. Then, in a poorly planned attempt to build a boat to escape with my entire family, my father was arrested and sent to labor at Mok Hoa. All the money was gone. With my husband arrested and myself, the eldest son, also stuck in jail not knowing what would happen, my mother had to take care of all 8 naive children, plus my sister-in-law and the newborn grandchild. Nobody in our family knew how to hold a hoe or grow anything, but we had to do it. My mother had thought about committing suicide many times, but she had to try to live because of her children and grandchildren. Thanks to the kindness of the local patients whom my sister had treated before, seeing my mother and siblings in such dire straits, they came to help. During busy farming seasons or during harvest times, they came to help our family. Thanks to them, everything turned out fine in the end. By 1978, I was released from the re-education camp and returned to live with my family as before. We relied on a durian and banana orchard and cultivated crops like corn, beans, and sweet potatoes. Our life was very difficult at that time. Around mid-1979, tragic news came. My father, because of his exile and additional sorrow, fell ill and died in the re-education camp at Mok Hoa. His body was buried by his fellow prisoners right in the Mok Hoa camp. Our family suffered such a great loss that no other calamity could compare. We applied to bring my father's body back, but by the time the news reached us, he had already been buried for nearly a month. And at the same time, Mok Hoa was flooded, making it impossible to reach. The local authorities said it was impossible to exhume the body now, the remains, and then cremate them and bring the ashes to the temple for worship. That was the best we could do. Exactly 49 days after his death, my family held a memorial service for my father. A nun who was familiar with our family came to help recite prayers for my father. After the ceremony, while everyone was sitting and chatting, my sister came in through my mother's body. After a while, my sister didn't come home as often as before, and sometimes we wondered why. My younger siblings and my wife noticed that whenever my sister came home, she would burst into tears and say, "Kim Lean, do you know that Dad is dead?" My sister cried as she passed by my mother's body, but she didn't say anything. In my grief, I angrily raised my voice to blame my sister. If Kim Lean has supernatural powers, why didn't she help Dad? Why didn't she stop Dad when he intended to build the boat? Or if she has supernatural powers, why didn't she help to prevent Dad from being arrested and dying in prison? My sister sat and cried for a while before speaking to everyone. Dad's matter, Kim Lean had seen it, had known for a long time. Just like everyone sitting in this house, Kim Lean also sees, and not that she doesn't, but Kim Lean can't do anything about it. Everyone who creates karma has to pay for it. No one can save this matter. Lord Kim Lean even became a great bodhisattva, but couldn't save his own mother and had to see his mother suffer in hell. So please don't blame Kim Lean. Kim Lean also feels very sad. Just like Kim Lean knows that Mom and the family are suffering a lot, sometimes not having enough to eat. Kim Lean can't provide money for Mom and the family. Kim Lean can only help create merit for Mom and the family in the future, as a way of repaying the kindness Mom showed by nurturing Kim Lean in the past. Kim Lean wants to help Mom and the family a lot, but can only help with what Kim Lean can, and gradually see the results of the merit that Kim Lean has created for the family. Kim Lean can't predict the future now. While lecturing the whole family like this for a while, suddenly she turned back to the nun who had come to recite prayers for my father and laughed as she said, "Hey, that nun, you've been chanting the Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva mantra to drive Kim Lean away, haven't you? Kim Lean isn't some demon to be driven away. Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva and Kim Lean may not follow the same path, but they're on the same journey. Kim Lean follows the path of Kim Lean's immortals, while bodhisattvas and nuns follow the Buddha's path. If you recite a mantra to drive away demons, it's fine, but Kim Lean isn't a demon, so don't be afraid of." She continued to laugh at the nun. The nun was startled and admitted that she didn't believe it, so she silently recited the Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva mantra in case there was a demon. She would be afraid and leave immediately. She didn't expect my sister to know, so she revealed it to everyone. Then, the conversation returned to the topic of my father's death. I asked my sister if she could ask for my father's return so the family could visit him. She sat down, calculating something with the red flames of the burning candles on her fingertips, and after a while, she said to everyone that she would bring our father back for us to visit. She instructed that when our father returned, we were not allowed to ask for it. We promised to do so. She left for a very long time, about half an hour. Then my father returned. At first, we thought it was my sister Kim Lean, but after my father cried and called each of our names, drawing us close, we knew it was really him. He came back to tell us that he died from heart disease and a ruptured blood vessel in the brain. The place where my siblings buried him was now flooded. My father lay very cold. The whole family cried rivers through my father's heart-wrenching story. He pulled my youngest sister and my son into his arms and cried like rain. I asked my father if his death was unjust or if it was his destined time to go. My father told me he died at the appointed time, not unjustly, but because he couldn't meet his wife and children. After a while of crying and storytelling, my father and the whole family felt less grief. I asked my father if he met Kim Lean. My father replied yes and seemed very afraid. He said, "Kim Lean now holds a high position and everyone is afraid when they see her." My father told me that when he was alive, Kim Lean was his daughter, but now he dare not look directly at Kim Lean anymore. I asked if Kim Lean helped him in any way. My father said yes. Kim Lean helped to preach to him and advised him to strive for enlightenment to end his karma quickly. At that moment, Although I trusted a lot, I still wanted to try and see what would happen. I pretended to ask my father some English words and idioms that I didn't know the meaning. My father explained each word and idiom to me clearly. At this point, I was so shocked that my whole body went cold. This couldn't be faked at all because my mother didn't know any English words. My father stayed for quite a while, continuing to talk with the family. Then suddenly he said he had to leave, finished speaking, cried loudly, and called each person to come and hug him. Then he left. After a while, my sister came back again, and the whole family asked her to occasionally bring my father back for us to visit. She said, "No, doing that isn't good for Dad. Let him meditate in peace. He still has a lot of heavy karma. Don't disturb him." Then she casually moved on to another topic. "Or do you still want to try?" I was shocked, sitting silently, not daring to say anything. That was the first and only time Kim Lean brought my father back to visit. That day happened to be the 49th day ceremony for my father, and later we asked several more times, but she didn't allow it. After my father's death, my mother was very sad, her spirits visibly low, coupled with the extremely difficult life on the farm that we still couldn't make ends meet, making my mother even more worried. We discussed selling all our houses and land and moving to Saigon to find another way to live. But it was a real headache with the household registration issue, and with so many people in the family, it wasn't something that could be done easily. Most of my siblings were still too young, light, and my mother was adamant about not letting them drop out of school. Whatever we did, they had to continue studying. So moving to Saigon to live was not easy at all. Besides, there were no more houses in Saigon for us to return to. So it was a plan that we didn't know how to carry out. In the following year, 1980, my wife gave birth to a daughter. Our family's situation was so difficult that sometimes my wife had to feed our daughter a mixture of rice water and sugar instead of milk because her health was not good, so she didn't have enough breast milk for the baby. On one occasion, when my sister returned, I asked her if she had any spiritual abilities, then please find a way to help the family because we couldn't survive in this situation. I also mentioned that it was the intention of my mother and us to sell everything and return to the city to live. My sister was very sad and informed me that she would be in the near future due to being busy. She had already calculated and created merits to help the family, but the time was not right yet, and the karma of my mother, my wife, and I, as well as everyone else, would have to endure more difficulties for some time before it became peaceful. I asked with frustration, "So how much longer do we have to endure?" She just shook her head sadly, not answering that question. However, she advised the family to persevere, as everything would be arranged nicely eventually. Although there would still be many dangers and difficulties, whenever something happened, she would intervene to save us from disasters and calamities, and all negative karma would be exhausted. She also added that in case of any emergencies, we should call her name and she would come to help. We must maintain strong faith. Honestly speaking, although I witnessed many strange things my sister did, I didn't believe at all in what she said would save my family from the current difficulties. Who would trust her words when they were in our situation back then? Although I thought so, I didn't dare to say it out loud. Not long after that, my family sold all the houses and land in Hungbin Hamlet and moved to Saigon, staying with my maternal aunt, my mother's sister. Although my aunt loved our family very much, sheltering our whole extended family at that time was extremely difficult. Not only financially, but also in terms of times, and our family took risks. But fortunately, there was a young policeman in the area with a very friendly disposition who took over responsibility for our neighborhood. Occasionally, I invited him for drinks, but honestly, I knew he was good to our family not because of this issue, but perhaps because he felt sorry for our impoverished family. He turned a blind eye to our family many times, and a few times during household registration, he informed us in advance so that our family could avoid it. Thanks to him, our suffering was somewhat alleviated. During this time, I repaired and pumped gas lighters to get by each day. My aunt had a sewing school, and she let my wife and two sisters got a job selling books in a bookstore. In general, life was relatively easier than before on the farm. At the same time, during this period, many patients who were previously treated by my sister came to help our family when they saw how difficult our situation was. Later, someone whose relative worked in the People's Committee of Funuan District helped our family obtain city residency. My wife and I still encountered many hardships, and I was imprisoned twice. In the midst of misery, we encountered another savior who rescued us from calamity. But those are other stories in my life. The story is truly strange and unbelievable, but it's a real story that even now, whenever I recall it, I still feel a chilling sensation. Writing this story again, I don't understand how what my sister said created merits for the family to experience. But one thing I find very strange. After selling all our houses and land and returning to Saigon, coincidences brought many people to help our family through various border crossings. More than 10 people went to the United States without spending a dime. My mother and youngest sister were also sponsored by my siblings to reunite, but because life in the United States was not suitable for my mother, she returned to Vietnam after just 1 year. Now, all my and well-behaved, academically successful children. Although not perfect, we are all very satisfied. I wonder if this is the result of the previous merits created by my spiritual sister in our family. Thunder flashes with each round and the wind howls like a storm. My group of friends consists of 4 people: myself, Chan, Louis, and Bao. During the summer break, we all went to Louis's hometown in Dong Xoai, Binh Phuoc Province. After dinner, Louis invited us all to go play Cao Co, a type of Vietnamese spiritual game, at the cemetery. Chan and Bao agreed immediately. As for me, being a city person, afraid of everything, I hesitated, but partly due to my pride with my friends, I reluctantly agreed. Since place, so I was somewhat fearful, especially on this day with such weather. We rode on 2 Honda motorcycles along the national highway towards the cemetery. The road was deserted at night, and we only encountered a few people during the entire journey. Trees grew densely along the road, with many having strange and eerie shapes that reminded me of the ghostly tree shadows I used to see when I was young. Upon arrival, we chose a relatively spacious grave inside the cemetery. Louis was familiar with this area and quite bold, so he confidently said, "You guys sit here, there's nothing to be afraid of." While saying that, Louis tapped his foot lightly on a stone slab with the image of a pretty girl but with a strange look in her eye, which made me feel scared. The flashlight we brought with us cast a dim light to illuminate the Cao Co board that we carried. On the board were letters from A to Z with all the punctuation marks. We were all searching for any leftover incense sticks near the graves when Chun finally found a few remaining ones, probably dropped by someone visiting. After lighting 3 incense sticks on the ground, we sat in a circle. Louis muttered a few words as if calling spirits, and then we placed our hands on the coin already placed on the Cao Co board. Louis signaled for us to remain silent. Then he spoke, "I want to know my father's name." Immediately, the coin moved sequentially across 3 letters to spell out H-U-Y. I was surprised the first time I played this game, and I always thought it was just a hoax. Now, witnessing the coin correctly spelling Louis's father's name, Hui, I was astonished. In turn, all 3 of us asked questions and each received accurate answers. Louis suddenly turned to us, smiling, then asked, "What time does the event start tomorrow?" The coin moved to the letters T and U, determining it was at 4. However, suddenly the coin moved slowly and then stopped at the letter 2, death. Bao exclaimed, "Oh damn, something's wrong." Our group was disheartened. Louis seemed calmer, but his face still showed clear concern. He tried to reassure us, saying, "Stay calm, everything will be okay." Chan and I regained some composure, but Bao's face was pale. He urged us to quickly leave and get back home. We walked in a single file towards where we parked our bikes, as the cemetery road was very narrow. Just as we were about to leave, Chan suddenly trembled and said, "Hey, where's Bao?" Louis and I turned back, and in that moment, a cold wind blew, and the trees rustled like eerie whispers. Louis said, "Let's go find him." We searched the cemetery for another half hour, but there was no sign of Bao. Occasionally, we shouted his name, but the only response was the rustling of leaves. Feeling defeated, we decided to leave, planning to inform Louis's uncle and return the next day to search again. Outside, the wind continued to howl and the thunder rumbled like a storm. After recounting the entire incident to Louis's uncle, Dong, who was a local, he firmly stated, "You guys are foolish. Sneaking into the cemetery at night, you probably offended the spirits." We exchanged glances and Louis slowly said, "We only played a game once." "What game?" Dong asked loudly. "Seeing grave." Dong sat down, his face grave. Having lived here for so long, he had witnessed many strange occurrences. He entered his house, put on his worn-out shirt, then turned to us and said, "Take me to where you were yesterday." We each had chaotic thoughts, but faced with the current situation, with our friend missing in the cemetery, we obeyed Louis's uncle. At exactly 11 o'clock, we arrived at the cemetery where we played the game the previous day. Chan looked around nervously and said shakily, "Did you guys bring the board back yesterday?" Louis and I shook our heads and looked down at where we were yesterday. The board was no longer there. We tried to reassure ourselves that perhaps the graveyard keeper had thoughts. I glanced at the black and white portrait of the young woman that I had seen yesterday, her eyes seeming sharper and her smile more sinister. Uncle Dong led us, each holding a candle, to the grave of the young girl. He muttered a few prayers, which I faintly heard but couldn't quite make out. After lighting the candles and saying the prayers, our group left. The scene now was vastly different, with beams piercing through the branches. I looked up, a shiver running down my spine, and stammered, "Bao, look." The three of us turned around. Bao was lying on a tree branch. Uncle Dong quickly climbed up to help him down, and then we all hurriedly rode our motorcycles back home. When we arrived home, Louis's grandfather had just returned from the city. We greeted him and slipped into Louis's room, each of us feeling bewildered, not understanding what was happening. In the evening, Bao also woke up. I asked, "What happened to you, Bao? Why were you lying on a tree? We searched everywhere for you." Bao, upon hearing my questions, seemed extremely confused. He stammered, "I don't know. You guys asked the cemetery keeper girl for directions." "What?" the three of us exclaimed. Louis continued, "What are you saying? We drove to pick up our bikes and then searched for you. How could this happen?" Hearing the commotion, Louis's grandfather entered and asked for the full story. After hearing our account, he sat down, his eyes distant. He then instructed us to lead him to the sacred grounds. He looked at the photo on the grave and fell into a trance. Realizing something was amiss, I asked him, "Sir, what's wrong?" Still in a daze, he shook himself and said softly, "This is my neighbor. You guys offended her, and she hid from you." All four of us were perplexed. Louis, in confusion, asked, But, what happened to her?" Grandfather motioned for us and began his story. Bin Phuc, Dong Xoai, July 1925, during the French colonial period. "Tien, let's go watch the provincial cultural performance," my close friend Kai said. I replied, "Wait a moment, I'll be right out. Did you invite Ho?" Ho is the most beautiful girl in this village. I've wanted to get to know her for a while, but she's been hesitant. The reason is her elderly parents, who need someone to take care. Today, the provincial cultural troupe returned. The three of us went to see them since noon. The troupe was lively and vibrant, with girls from the province causing a stir among the village boys. Their laughter and chatter mixed with the elderly's voices. As the festivities wound down, we headed back home, each going our separate ways. I walked a short distance before turning back to check on my friend, making sure he hadn't lagged behind. Then I quietly followed Ho. When I got close, I gently placed my hands on her shoulders, causing her to startle and turn around to scold me lovingly. "What are you doing? People can see us now," she said. "Hey, who would be around at this hour, huh?" I walked for a bit, then missed you, so I came back. Trouble, I rushed outside to see 2 French military planes in the sky and 3 trucks carrying soldiers advancing towards the village. I knew something serious was happening. I stood there watching as the French rounded up the villagers from their homes and then killed them. Each gunshot sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, I remembered Ho. Quietly, I followed the drainage ditch to Ho's house. When I arrived, I heard Ho, and then I saw them emerge. I stood there dumbfounded, unable to believe my eyes. Before me was Ho, tied up with her hands behind her back, her clothes torn and disheveled. Behind her were a French officer and Kai. Could she have betrayed us? Was she leading the French? I listened intently to their conversation. Les petits enfants qui, the French officer said, pointing at me. Cognane la ai. Il est mon voisin, Kai replied. Na la hang som toi. Mai kamu nim tu nochong? The officer asked Kai. Do you want to taste it? The officer asked Kai. The officer smirked, then suddenly he and Kai humiliated Ho. After that, the officer stood up coldly. Fire! Ho collapsed behind the coconut tree. The cold sound of gunfire echoed. I stood there, filled with anger. My hands clenched so tightly they bled. I vowed that one day I would send that wretched officer to the underworld. But time passed. News came that Kai had gone missing. We didn't know where to look. Then, new economic opportunities, land development plans occupied my mind. Louis' grandfather shed tears, his back hunched. When he looked up, he saw Bao's eyes bloodshot, his face pale. He exclaimed to us, "He must have been possessed." After saying that, the grandfather asked each of us to kneel down in front of the grave of the girl named Ho. Then he prayed, "Ho, you lived a virtuous life. I know these youngsters have offended you, but please forgive them for my sake. Life is full of folly when you're young." After finishing his prayer, the grandfather bowed 3 times, and we followed suit. Only Bao remained kneeling in silence, looking even more distressed. Louis' grandfather noticed this and called Bao's family over. In the afternoon, the familiar sound of Bao's father's Honda motorcycle stopped in front of my house. Bao's father, grandfather, and Bao himself got out. While Louis' grandfather talked to Bao's grandfather outside, Bao's father rushed into the room to check on his son's condition. Louis' grandfather stayed outside to talk, and I sat next to him, listening to their conversation. "What's your name? How old are you?" Louis' grandfather asked. "My name is Kai, Din Van Kai, 76 years old. I used to live here during the French colonial period, but then I had to move to the city," Kai replied, taking a sip of his tea and smiling. I noticed Bao's grandfather's complexion suddenly change, but before anything could be said, we heard Chun calling. When I ran inside, I saw Bao bleeding from his eyes and foaming at the mouth in a panic. Before I could react, there was a loud crash. I rushed out to see what happened. Bao's grandfather was lying on the ground, blood pouring from his head, next to a shattered glass. Above him stood Tien, holding the broken handle of the glass, muttering, "I'm avenging her. I'm avenging her." Chun, Louis, and Bao's father all ran out. Seeing this horrifying scene, everyone stood frozen in shock. Louis' grandfather collapsed in tears. There was a figure of a girl in a bee-like dress standing, silently retreating behind the coconut tree. Thunder suddenly roared, lightning flashed intermittently, and the wind howled like a storm. My grandmother used to say that ghosts are real. Dequa, Long An is my hometown. I've heard a lot about ghosts from my grandmother and Aunt Eight. People I know have also talked about it. Most adults avoid telling ghost stories to children. True. But the stories from my grandmother and Aunt Eight have stuck with me since I was little, because I know they didn't make them up. Now, I'll take some time to tell you each of these small stories. Back then, in my hometown, my grandmother lived either in the temple, a temple built by my family to worship Guanyin, Buddha, and our ancestors. Anyone with bones could be brought into the temple, or in the forest. I don't know if anyone knows this term. The forest is the forest inside the town, not outside the town. My grandmother had a house down there, and my maternal grandmother's grave was buried nearby. Occasionally, she would come up to my house in Saigon to visit and sleep with me. Every night, she would tell me the stories she experienced. My grandmother was used to being in the forest hut. Sometimes, while she was sleeping, She felt arms reaching into her bed. When she woke up, she only saw faces and hands, but no bodies. Back then, she used oil lamps instead of electric lights, which made it even more eerie. But the next day, it would happen again. Once, my Aunt 8 stayed with my grandmother. When my grandfather went to Saigon, Aunt 8, who was still young at the time, slept alone there and experienced the same thing. She saw my grandmother's likeness exactly, and being alone was too scared to stay inside, so she grabbed her shoes and stood outside, too scared to go back in. Luckily, my father knew Aunt 8 was alone, so he went into the hut and found her, asking her to come back inside and sleep peacefully. My grandmother often saw her deceased mother reminding her that she was thirsty for coffee. So, every morning she would drink a cup of coffee, and sometimes she would hear American soldiers' American military hat outside her door. She used it as a tool, saying it was very effective and didn't break. Hey. My father was a soldier back then, and he encountered many strange occurrences. He told stories of passing through the forest and seeing many corpses. Sometimes, while he was sleeping, ghosts would throw rocks at him, causing him to run away in fear. My aunt's house was located in the town, and despite being relatively large because my stepfamily lived downstairs, it was filled with spirits. When I was young, I lived there for a month during the summer, but I never stepped out past 10 o'clock at night. I thought it was around 9 o'clock, but the house would be... Once, my sister Diem went downstairs, passing through the back of the house. After a while, she came back and said that when she went downstairs, she saw a head moving back and forth. She was so scared that she closed her eyes and ran straight upstairs. When she finished telling us, the power went out. Luckily, those people let me sleep inside. Then, just last year, during a gathering at my aunt's house, we went to a temple to offer incense to the Buddha. Every year, my aunt organizes this for Buddhists. She and my late grandfather were both spiritual leaders. That day, I mainly went to the beach and ate scallops. It was only my grandmother, my youngest uncle, my aunt's daughter, and me at the house. My late grandfather had just returned from the US and was tired, so he stayed home. The four of us stayed at my aunt's house. When I returned from the beach, I stayed at my aunt's house for one night before returning to Saigon the next morning. My grandmother told me, "At night, your youngest uncle, your cousin, and the little girl all slept in the large room. Your grandfather slept in a separate room next to them. At night, the ghost went up and down the stairs, and we all heard it. Your cousin cried, and your youngest uncle thought it was a thief, so he ran downstairs. But when he didn't see a dog or hear barking, he found your cousin crying in a corner. He thought it was a ghost, so he carried her to my grandfather's room, and I followed. We didn't hear anything after that. It was because there were few people at home that night, so it acted out, but it didn't dare to misbehave in front of my grandfather." After my Aunt Dao and her daughter went to Australia, their room became vacant. At that time, a Buddhist nun, who used to stay in the temple, came to my aunt's house to sleep for one night. She slept in Aunt Dao's room, and the next morning she died unexpectedly. People found her in bed and took her away for cremation, but her spirit lingered around my aunt's house. My grandmother dreamed of her every night. When Aunt Dao returned from Australia and slept in that room, she saw the nun standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her. Aunt Dao was also afraid of ghosts, so my aunt performed a ritual. She dressed like a spiritual leader. I saw it myself at the time. After that, we never saw the nun's spirit again. And this happened more than 10 years ago when I was just a 5th grade student at an elementary school, whose name I'll keep hidden. It was a heavy workload. Sometimes we couldn't finish our exam preparation during the morning sessions, so we had to attend evening classes for extra tutoring. In my class, I had a close friend named Trung. We were close partly because we lived in the same neighborhood, and partly because I used to pass by his house every day on my way to school, so we naturally started hanging out together. One evening, as usual, Trung and I went to school. Because I was small, I was assigned to sit at the front desk, while Trung, being tall, sat at the back. Our school was a religious school, privately run, so unlike public schools, there were no portraits of Uncle Ho on the walls. Instead, there were portraits of nuns. Our class also had one such portrait. That evening, when our teacher finished teaching, it was only 9 o'clock. Trung and I were standing outside buying banana ice cream. Actually, only he bought it. I didn't. We were also waiting for our class monitor, Ngun, to leave together because she had to tidy up the classroom, erase the board, and clean the desks. As Ngun was coming down the stairs, our classroom was on the upper floor. I suddenly remembered that I had left my pencil case in the drawer. Feeling brave, I asked Trung to wait for me while I went back to the classroom to get it. Just then, Ngun's father arrived to pick her up. As I reached the classroom door, I felt a chill run down my spine. As I glanced up at the portrait of the nun, it was gone. I started to feel scared, but I tried to reassure myself, thinking that maybe the security guard had taken it down earlier to clean. Instead of going in, I stood outside and leaned in to grab it, because I sat at the front, so I didn't want to go inside. When I got my pencil case and looked up, I was startled to see someone sitting in Trung's seat at the back of the class. Thinking it was Trung playing a prank on me, I mocked him. "Is that you, Trung?" There was silence for about 3 seconds, then suddenly it started raining outside and a bolt of lightning flashed. In the dim light, I recognized the face of the nun, the one I saw smiling at me in a terrifying way. I felt like I was going crazy. I screamed and ran away. Trung heard me from the playground below and ran up, still holding the half-eaten banana ice cream. I ran past him, yelling, "There's a ghost, run!" Later, as I ran past Trung's house, I saw him sitting in front of his door, still holding the banana ice cream. I didn't think much of it at the time. When I got home, soaked, I quickly changed my clothes and went to bed. I woke up feeling groggy and didn't feel like going to school, but because my parents pressured me, I reluctantly decided to go. As I passed by Trung's house, intending to invite him to school, I learned that he had died the previous evening. His mother was wailing loudly, and I stood there in shock. I heard he had fallen down the stairs, suffered a head injury, and died. Stunned, I walked on. Today, I was late, so when I arrived, the whole class had already gone in. Thinking about encountering the nun, as soon as I stepped into the classroom, I immediately looked down at where the nun's portrait used to be, which was also Trung's seat. I felt like screaming, but I couldn't because as I looked down, I saw Trung sitting there, looking at me with a smile, holding a half-eaten banana ice cream. I fainted and was taken to the hospital. I had to stay in the hospital for a week, missing my final exams. After that, my father found a public school for me to attend 5th grade again, and we had to move to a new place closer to the school. Later, when I returned to the old school, I found out that our classroom used to be the living quarters for the nuns. One nun had died in that room from a sudden illness while sleeping, and the bed she lay on was exactly where Trung used to sit. Back then, around the beginning of the summer of the 3rd year, after finishing the exams, I hurriedly arranged to go home. As you all know, poor students who live far away from home only get to see their family's roof a few times a year, so any chance to go in the cold. Without hesitation, I went straight to the bus station. By the time I boarded the last bus, the sun had set. Regardless, bringing my body back to my parents was a blessing. The journey started smoothly, and as the engine hummed softly, everyone, including myself, dozed off. About 3 or 4 hours later, there was the sound of squealing wheels as 2 passengers, an old man and a child, likely father and son, boarded the bus. The gentle girl politely asked if she could sit in the 2 empty seats next to me. I only managed to smile back at her before I dozed off again. The sleep was abruptly interrupted by violent coughing, sounding like an elderly man signaling something ominous. Finally, of an empty field when the clock struck 11. Passengers almost wanted to cry when informed that they could only continue the journey after a repair, at least until 5 a.m. Not just them, My face contorted when I found myself standing in the middle of nowhere, with no shelter in sight, not even a tree's shadow, let alone a roof. In the sky, a few stars were twinkling, whether sympathetically or mockingly, and on the ground, insects were playing together in a symphony without a conductor. Perhaps it was too stifling. The bus was packed with people sitting and lying down, so I couldn't even close my eyes. Finally, I decided to kill time by field, letting the wind blow freely, unbuttoning my shirt. I shivered and was about to return to the bus when I suddenly saw a house. Oddly, I hadn't seen it on the bus, even though it was only a few hundred meters from the parking lot. My curiosity drove me closer to see what it was because, compared to the house, it was too small. It turned out to be a tomb. Being the bold person I am, I peered inside. The immaculate tiled floor was inviting, and I decided to lean against it rather than squeeze into the cramped and gasoline-scented metal box outside. With that thought, I stepped inside, where the raised grave lay underground, leaving the entire upper floor empty, like a premium stage. Fortunately, I stumbled upon an from last night. I lit it up. On the largest wall, there were engraved names, birth years of the deceased. I shone the light on it. It turned out the deceased was a very young girl, only 18 years old. A moment of sorrow, a life too short. What could have made such a young girl depart from life so hastily? It must have been terrible. Suddenly, drowsiness crept in. A bit hesitant, but then I reassured myself that this place wasn't far from where the bus parked, so I decided to spend the night in the tomb. As soon as I leaned against the wall, I fell asleep. The oil lamp flickered, casting shaky shadows on the wall, and outside, the night and the roaring wind continued their journey. I don't know how long it had been when I woke up startled, only to meet a pair of eyes staring at me intently. I jerked, thinking I was facing a ghostly apparition, but then I breathed a sigh of relief when I realized it was the girl from the bus earlier. Caught in the act of peeking, she smiled sheepishly and looked away. Beside her was an old man snoring, unaware of anything. Happy to have a companion and wanting to ease the girl's embarrassment, I introduced myself. The girl seemed a bit shy, probably because it was late at night with a strange guy, so she answered my questions timidly and the old man kept snoring. But then she became more confident and our conversation started flowing. Occasionally, she burst into laughter when I cracked a joke. Thanks to I learned that she was being taken to Saigon by her father to take the university entrance exam and was on her way back. Despite the dim light of the almost empty oil lamp, I could still determine that she had a pretty face, but her skin was too white, almost glowing in the dark. Perhaps what she trusted me most about was when she found out I was also a tutor for gifted students. She immediately asked me to help her with the university entrance exam she had just taken. Showing off my skills in front of a beautiful girl, what could be better? But when I received the exam paper and her solution, for some reason, my hands suddenly turned cold. A strange sensation crept all over my body, making me shiver sometimes. Sensing my unusual behavior, the girl smiled and made me feel foolish. Perhaps it was just the damp breeze from outside creeping in here. Comforting myself like that, I bent down to the paper. There were a few mistakes the girl had made in the math part, so I corrected and completed it. The girl's eyes welled up when she realized she had made a mistake in half of the math problem. I comforted her with all my heart. Whether it's fate or opportunity, I encouraged again. Our conversation shifted to another direction, lively, until the distant crowing of a rooster in the field startled her. She hastily pulled out from her pocket a photo intended as a souvenir for our rather strange encounter. The strange cold feeling from earlier lingered, but this time I was prepared, so I didn't startle like before. In the photo, the girl looked stunning in her flowing white dye, and I couldn't help but compliment her again, causing her to blush once more. Just then, the honking of a car horn signaled the completion of repairs. I stood up. The old man had also been awakened. I nodded to greet him, noticing that he, too, had a pale complexion like his daughter's. Clearly, both father and daughter got off the bus with me, didn't they? As the bus started to move jerkily, I panicked and shouted, "Hey driver, there are 2 more people." The annoyed driver waved his hand and counted the passengers. "We're all set, 36 people. Nobody missing." I stubbornly protested. There were definitely 2 people sitting next to me. The passengers began to look at me uneasily. A middle-aged woman, sitting in the row behind, leaned forward and scolded. "What are you talking about? Since the bus left Saigon until now, you've been the only one sitting in this row. There's been no one beside you." I shuddered. The strange cold feeling from last night creeped to crane my neck towards the direction of the tomb, wondering if they had left something behind. But no. Under the increasingly clear daylight, it was just an empty piece of land. I trembled and quickly reached into my bag, hastily pulling out the papers that I had corrected for the girl's exam yesterday. Oh God, in my hand were only dried leaves covered with my crossed-out lines, and the girl's handwriting had completely disappeared. And then the photo she gave me, heaven and earth, it was just a blank photo with nothing on it. A blurry white. Spooky. At this point, Kwong stopped abruptly, looking around at the stunned faces of us for a while before pulling out something from his pocket. Well, now. We all grabbed each other's hands, and indeed, it was a blank photo with nothing on it. When the photo came into my hands, somehow I felt the same chilling sensation as before. Kwong continued. But wait, when we returned to school after the summer break, I happened to be looking at the list of successful candidates. Guess what? I nearly fainted when I saw the name and birth year of the owner of the tomb where I accidentally slept that night. And what's even weirder, from then on, after every entrance exam, that girl's name appeared on the list of successful candidates. Taking the photo back from me, Kwong suddenly turned pale, walked out without saying a word. The rest of us were in a frenzy. So real. Not to mention the photo, perfectly fitting the story. Nobody can refute it. A photo taken from the underworld. How could anyone dare to scrutinize it? Brilliant, brilliant, impressive. As I watched my friends clamoring like madmen, I initially intended to remain silent, but I couldn't hold it anymore. I shouted loudly, "Shut up, you fools!" Truth, or at least something close to it. 2 years ago, an old man accompanied his youngest daughter to Saigon for her university entrance exam, and their return journey never reached its destination. Both of them perished in a traffic accident. The girl didn't have the chance to see her acceptance letter, and do you know who they are? Kwong referred to the old man as her father, and the girl trailed him just 2 years later. My friends deflated like a balloon losing air, their faces showing disbelief. But wait, with every entrance exam, Kwong would be like a machine, always checking the list of successful candidates. I wonder if he ever found any good news for that unfortunate girl. This afternoon, Hawaii went fishing as usual, but he suddenly decided to change fishing spots. So he ran down to the other side of the bridge and chose a stretch of river he had never tried before. Strangely, the sky darkened early today, barely past 6 o'clock, and it was already dusk all around. Mr. Hawaii descended the bridge confidently, stopped at his chosen spot, and began baiting his hook. It was quiet and deserted around here. Only him. Thinking he might catch a lot of fish without competition, he smiled to himself. Just as he was about to light a cigarette, he heard a noise. Suddenly, the coconut trees swayed rustlingly, and the air turned chillingly cold despite the lack of wind. Mr. Hawaii leaned forward, listening to the heavy footsteps splashing through the water, seeing their faces clearly. He could only make out their figures, a man and a woman helping each other to the shore. Perplexed, he spoke up. "Are you two okay? Did your boat capsize?" They remained silent for a moment before the young man hesitantly replied, "No, uncle, we're fine, just wet. It's nothing." Before Mr. Hawaii could ask further, he heard the girl sobbing, her voice trembling. "I'm so cold, please. I'll hold you, don't cry anymore. People might hear," the boy reassured her. "I want to go home, I miss home." "Wait, I'll find a way to take you home." The girl sniffled, and the boy comforted her. Mr. Hawaii couldn't help but be curious and wonder why these young lovers were wading through the river. Were they running away from home or going somewhere? On the other side was just a densely waterlogged islet. No houses there. He couldn't help but stoop down to eavesdrop. not caring whether the fish were biting or not. It was strange. Why didn't they take the road instead of wandering under this branch of the river? It was dark now, so were they planning to sit here until morning? Unable to resist, Mr. Hoai asked, "Where do you two live?" "Far from here. I can give you a ride. This area is very deserted and there's no transportation around here for you to catch." They didn't answer, knowing they were hesitant, so Mr. Hoai continued with a smile. Tonight is the Mid-Autumn Festival, and since you guys didn't catch me earlier, don't worry, I'll give you a ride home." The young man hesitated before asking, "Uncle, haven't you caught any fish yet?" "You can't watch properly with us bothering you. Let us help you first." Mr. Hoai quickly interjected, jokingly reassuring him, "Today is the full moon day. Perhaps the shrimps and fish are all out partying. Sitting here won't do me any good, so I'd rather help you two get home safely. Besides, being all wet like this might give me bad luck with fishing." As he spoke, he gathered his fishing gear and belongings and headed up, turning to the coconut grove, he home. The girl had been silent until now, but with a hesitant yet relieved tone, she said, "Please, uncle, take us back. Our parents must be worried sick." Mr. Hoai led them through the coconut grove to where he had parked his old motorbike. He, being frail, sat at the front, leaving room for the two behind him. He handed the fishing basket to the young man to hold. Sensing their thin frames, the bike felt lighter, but Mr. Hoai's back chilled from their cold, wet clothes. He sped off as directed by the young man. They went down a narrow alley, looking for a house with a green gate under a bougainvillea trellis on the left. He stopped the bike, let them off, and turned around. He started feeling the house spilling out. Mr. Hoai finally saw the sadness in their eyes, their pale faces and muddy, tangled hair. The girl, especially, looked pitiful, likely to catch a heavy cold besides being punished for running away with a boy. Parking the bike, Mr. Hoai felt dizzy and nauseous. "Ugh, why does it smell so foul?" He quickly dumped his fishing gear and stripped off his clothes, heading for a shower. Feeling exhausted, Mr. Hoai poured some tea from the pot to wake himself up before gathering the fishing basket to put it away. He was surprised. Why was it so heavy? Holding it up to the light, he saw several fresh fish inside. Clearly, he hadn't caught any. Was he dreaming? Or did the young man swap baskets with him? That made me annoyed. He decided to rest for a moment before returning the fish basket. As he wiped his sweat and reached for the newspaper, he suddenly jerked at the sight of two familiar faces in the missing persons ad. He broke into a cold sweat, and suddenly he smelled something rank nearby. He wiped his sweat and quickly put on his sandals, grabbing the bike and rushing back to the house in the alley. The lights were still on inside. He knocked on the door, not having a moment to think about what he would say. A man opened the door and asked, "Who are you?" Mr. Hoai raised his head, hoping to see the two people from earlier, then replied hesitantly, "I was looking for the two youngsters earlier." The man grabbed him in joy. "Have you seen my child?" "Yes, I brought them here. I let them off right outside this gate." The man furrowed his brow, unable to hide his sorrow. "They've been missing for days. I've searched everywhere, sent texts, even the police couldn't find any trace of them." Mr. Hoai was even more puzzled, scratching his head as if talking to himself. Strange, could they have returned to that place? "Where is that place? Can you take me there, where you last saw them?" The old man suddenly urged. Then, the old man sighed, "I'm so worried. Last night, I dreamt that they were crying and saying they wanted to go home but didn't know how to get there. They begged me, 'Dad, find a way for us to go home.' Before I could embrace and comfort them, I woke up, fearing something to them. I'm so scared. I pray to heaven as a witness, forgiving them if they return." Mr. Hoai recounted the situation and took the old man to the riverbank. He led him into the coconut grove to the spot where the two had been sitting. Suddenly, the full moon shone eerily bright, illuminating the puddle where the two bodies were huddled together, looking very tragic. When I was 18, living in District 5, my family was quite well off due to our business. Whenever someone in our extended family in the countryside was sick and needed to come to Saigon for treatment, they would always come to my parents' house to be taken care of in terms of food, transportation, and accommodation. That time, it was Aunt Sal from the countryside bringing my son to Saigon for medical treatment. He was also 18, the same age as me. Right from the start, I didn't like Tan's spoiled brat attitude. He would call his mom for everything. Sometimes, while my aunt was eating, he would call her 4 or 5 times. Mom, I have a headache. Mom, get me medicine. Mom, I don't feel like eating rice. Mom, buy me a sandwich. He was so annoying, tall and big, but always whining for his mother. I silently thought so. Tan, big and strong, suffered from excruciating headaches, which had been occurring for 3 months. By the time he was brought to Saigon, the headaches had become more frequent and intense. I vividly remember one day, Tan's mother, after taking him to Cho Ray Hospital, noticed a bruise next to his nostrils, indicating signs of an infected cheekbone. Tan said he got hit by a tree branch while playing soccer at school. He thought it was nothing, but the bruise developed into an infection. The hospital had to perform surgery to drain it. Tan stayed in Cho Ray Hospital for 3 days. Every day, his mother would rush over with food and clothes, taking care of him. I was deeply moved by a mother's boundless love for her son, but the more I sympathized with her, the more I disliked the spoiled brat Tan, who was so weak. On a Tuesday afternoon, Aunt Sal said she didn't understand why Tan refused to undergo surgery. She said he claimed he no longer felt any pain and didn't anymore. Despite his parents' pleading, he insisted on being discharged to return home to Vĩnh Long. Aunt Sal used delaying tactics, pretending to agree to his discharge, but said there was no ferry to Vĩnh Long that day, so they would go early the next morning. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Tan and his parents walked into the house from Cho Ray Hospital. He smiled at me, but I just glanced at him with one eye and looked away, ignoring him. He cursed me silently, muttering, "If you were my younger brother, you would die with me." I muttered curses at Tan and went straight upstairs. In the evening, my mother cooked many delicious dishes to treat Aunt Sal. Tan demanded that I take him for a stroll on the motorbike. That afternoon, I remember scolding Tan like this: "You have too much free time, blaming Dad, then Mom, and now daring to blame me." As dusk fell around 9 o'clock in the evening, my mother returned from the temple, and both she and Aunt Sal sat in front of the house. I saw Aunt Sal coming downstairs, fetching a cyclo to go to Haohui, Cholun, to buy hutiao for him to eat. Could I not get angry? There was a hutiao shop nearby, but he insisted on eating Lakai-style hutiao. Seeing Aunt Sal's frail figure hunching over the cyclo, she squeezed onto the seat. Involuntarily, I blurted out, "If I were like you, Tan, I'd be cursing my ancestors. You ungrateful child." I silently cursed Tan, not realizing that my mother, sitting beside me, couldn't hear me either, as Tan was on the 3rd floor at that time. How could he hear? Yet, later, while everyone was asleep around 3 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly heard loud cries from Tan's room. I jumped up and ran out, and all the lights on every floor were turned on, illuminating the house brightly. There were many servants in the house, and everyone witnessed a scene that no one could explain. Tan lay there, eyes rolled back, froth at the corners of his mouth, muttering incomprehensibly, occasionally convulsing. What was strange was that at least 3 times his whole body was lifted about 2 fists' length off the bed and then dropped back heavily. His head jerked violently on the bed, and he screamed, "Stop! It hurts! It hurts too much! Stop!" Tan remained in the same position, lifted and dropped again, and this phenomenon happened quickly, witnessed by many people. Then, as Mrs. Tan cried out, Mr. Tan decided to call a car to take him back to the hospital. For the first time, I cried, perhaps out of fear. While everyone tied Tan's hands, I hugged him tightly and said, "You're so pitiful, Tan. You're in a lot of pain, right? Hang in there, Tan. The doctor will give you some medicine soon, and you'll feel better." While waiting for the body to be taken away, I heard Mrs. Spoye Tan recount that at exactly noon, the hour of the horse, Tan asked her to go downstairs to buy him a few sleeping pills because he hadn't been able to sleep since the previous night. He said, "I'm cured. If you buy me sleeping pills, I'll feel better." After handing him over to the people in the same room, my aunt went down the elevator. As the elevator door opened, she heard a scream outside the courtyard. Everyone rushed out, and she followed. A horrifying scene unfolded before her eyes. Tan lay face down, eyes still open, his hospital gown soaked in fresh blood. My aunt collapsed unconscious and knew nothing more after that. At that moment, I suddenly understood that, like children often tell stories to each other, Tan might have done the same. He had told me about how he jumped out of the window for the last time, fell, and how he wanted me to see him for the last time. However, I had never given him a friendly smile until we parted ways. Later, every time I visited Tan's grave in the countryside and looked at the 5-tiered tomb, it pained me deeply. A murderer sentenced to death might not suffer as much as someone whose lifetime sin could never be revealed. I have repented many times, forgiven myself many times, but every time I think of Tan's tragic death, regret floods over me. It wasn't my fault, but fate is so cruel. Why me? Why did those who passed away choose a naive 18-year-old girl who knew nothing to bear such bitter curses? Whenever Tan's name is mentioned, I am filled with remorse. When I was young, I was very quiet, preferring silence even when I had something to say. Ironically, since meeting Tan, I've only spewed words like swords, as if an invisible force drove me to curse him like that. Tan was just a distant relative to me. From the first time I met him until the last, I never smiled at him, not even a polite smile. And afterwards, it's just been a lifelong regret haunting me like the heaviest punishment. Thank you all so much. It's a ghost story filled with heartache, prayers for Tan's soul, sensing that the story has been revealed like a confession. Please forgive the innocent youth who spoke harsh words out of ignorance. Today, choked with repentance, I hope Tan's spirit will forgive everything and quickly attain enlightenment. No return. Allow me to express my repentance, knowing you won't respond. Your soul wanders back to visit Ut. Please accept my sincere apology. Will my belated smile reach you? Accept it with compassion, not blame. Jokes and laughter like the full moon, bringing peace to a distant place. With love to my departed brother. End.